Good evening, everyone. This is Subhash Gatade. Welcome you all to a special lecture in the Democracy Dialogue series, organized by New Socialist Initiative, an ideological political platform. As you might know, Democracy Dialogue is a conversation we have started during the pandemic to discuss the state of India's democracy and where it is headed. It is driven by an urge to understand the paradox, how independent India, which started with Nehru, uh, ended up with a prime minister like Narendra Modi, a society which was far less developed, far less educated, gave rise to leaders like Gandhi, Nehru, Maulana Azad, Bhagat Singh, and gave itself a constitution, and a society that is now better fed, better educated, where democracy has become more entrenched, has brought upon itself the threat and a disaster of a majoritarianism, authoritarianism, and a bigoted fascistic leadership. Till date, there have been 22 lectures in the series. Leading public intellectuals, writers, and activists have honored us by joining this conversation. Today happens to be a special lecture in this series where Dr. Ravi Sinha, author, activist, physicist, will be talking on science as a cultural ideal. Dr. Ravi Sinha has been associated with progressive movements for the last 4 decades. He is trained as a theoretical physicist, has a doctorate degree from MIT, Cambridge. He worked as a physicist at University of Maryland, at a physical research laboratory in Ahmedabad, and at Gujarat University, before resigning from the job to devote full time to organizing and theorizing. He is the principal author of the book Globalization of Capital, published in 1997, co-founder of the Hindi journal Sandhan, and one of the founders and a leading member of New Socialist Initiative. Before proceeding further, let me tell you that Ravi has been a long friend and a comrade. We have been together in the left movement for the last few decades, and one has learned a lot from him during all these years. I thank him especially for agreeing to deliver this lecture, a theme around which he has been brooding for the last many years. Today in this special lecture, Ravi wants to unpack how does science seeps into culture with a special focus on India, discuss the famous Needham Question about why the rest of the world missed out on the scientific revolution, and also understand the two broad brush texts, namely the right wing and the left liberal, on the glory of the ancient civilization and who could we consider his great spoiler. And after casting a critical glance at Bhakti movement, wants to conclude talk by making some tentative suggestions about how to seek pathways to a future in which science can attain the status of a cultural ideal, which in turn may facilitate emergence of an Indian modernity worthy of a glorious civilization. Friends, please welcome Dr. Ravi Sinha.
Thank you, Subhash. And thank you all for coming. It kind of feels odd to speak on something like science and culture, given all that is happening around us in the country. But hopefully, what I have to say, you will see that what I am going to say is not that disconnected or irrelevant for the current political situation either. We have followed a custom that in this Democracy Dialogue series, we do not have any speaker from among ourselves, but this one was made as an exception because our team, our comrades, people like Subhash and others have been insisting that some of the things we all have been thinking together and brainstorming together, some of those things should be put out too. So that's the reason why I venture in this series, because this series is a series of stalwart speakers, and I do not fit into that kind of list, But I hope you'll bear with me. Also, I am known for, when I speak, going here and there and always overshooting the time limit. So I decided to write it up, whatever I have to say. So I will just go by the text, and please bear with me. It might sometimes appear as, studentish, Also, I just finished writing it up just, 1 hour before now. So I haven't really edited it well. Sometimes it may be verbose, so please bear with me. So here it goes, this talk was originally planned for the Science Day, but I hope what I'm going to say will be relevant for all the other days too. On February 28, 1928, C.V. Raman, who was born in 1888 and died in 1970, along with his student, K.S. Krishnan, born in 1898 and died in 61, together they discovered what is known as the Raman effect. Raman was awarded the Physics Nobel Prize in 1930 for the discovery, and since 1987, this day has been celebrated in India as the National Science Day. Science in the Indian subcontinent experienced a remarkable awakening during the half-century prior to independence and the creation of two sovereign countries out of British India. We can even call it reawakening, given the millennial civilizational history of India. Starting with Jagdish Chandra Bose, I have written their birth date and death date just to let those of you know who may not remember what was their time period, but it will take time to read that, so I will just skip that. Starting with Jagdish Chandra Bose, who discovered wireless transmission of radio waves before Marconi and should have at least shared the latter's Nobel Prize in 1909. And Prafulla Chandra Ray, the father of modern chemistry in India. After them, we had the second generation of pioneers in Raman, Meghnath Saha, Satyendranath Bose, and Prashant Chandra Mahalanobis. And of course, we had the miracle called Srinivas Ramanujan, born in 1887 and died young in 1920, one of the greatest mathematical geniuses ever. A third generation of scientific luminaries started its career in British India and continued to flourish in the post-colonial period, although some of them chose to work and live outside the subcontinent. Homi Jahangir Bhabha, Subramaniam Chandrasekhar, Vikram Sarabhai, Hargobind Khurana, Harish Chandra, Amal Kumar Rai Chaudhary, and Abdul Salam were among the prominent names. All these scientists were born in a society that was far less educated and much less fed than it is today. All of them made lasting, even path-breaking contributions to the world of science. It may be added that with the exception of Raman, Bose, S.N. Bose, Srinivas Ramanujan, and A.K. Rai Chaudhary, they were all trained abroad as scientists and mathematicians. The exceptions too were product of the British education, even if trained on the Indian soil. The life story of each one of them, some more than the others, is a fascinating one, and one could spend a great deal of time reveling in that. But my plan in this talk is not to take that path. This marvelous burst of scientific creativity in a subjugated society should encourage, among other things, considerations on the place of science in a culture and the role it has played in the history of civilizations. It should also inspire searching for pathways through which science can find a place in the mind of a civilization as one of its cultural ideals. I will use these scientists who kindled a sense of awakening in the subcontinent to the powers and potentials of modern science only as an opening gambit. My considerations necessarily sketchy, will be focused on the civilizational and historical processes that aid or obstruct the seeping in of the cognitive values engendered by science into the cultural soil of a society or a civilization. I am primarily concerned with the fate of science in our civilization, our own civilization, but it is a subject in which a comparative glance at other civilizations become unavoidable. If one were to take a sweepingly broad view of science, it can be taken as a defining feature of the human species right from the time it walked out of the animal kingdom. Humans have always endeavored to make sense of the world and make changes to that world in order to survive and flourish. But this story has not been one single story. Many distinct civilizations, large and small, and an enormous diversity of cultures have arisen in the long course of human history. They have all devised their separate, even if overlapping, worldviews for making sense of the world and for ensuring their own survival and success. Inevitably, human beings have simultaneously struggled to find their own place in this world, which in the first instance appears to be externally given. For all we know, humans are the only medium through which the universe begins to look at itself. Deep conundrums arise when mind arises from matter. This has given rise to an enormous corpus of philosophies and theologies. The mind that looks outside cannot avoid looking inside. The complexity is not confined to the entanglement of the individual mind with the physical universe. As I mentioned, humans have dealt with the universe invariably as separate civilizations and societies. I will not go into the debates about how the species is splintered into civilizations, or whether the emergence of the species was from the beginning a multi-locational event spread across space and time and distributed in many separate instances. For our purpose, it is enough to start with the premise that humans have dealt with the world always as collectives, and these have been, by and large, bounded collectives. Hence, the challenge of dealing with the universe has always coexisted with the challenge of humans dealing with each other. Mind arises from matter and evolves in interaction with the universe, but it evolves as much, if not more, through social processes too. That is why there was that ancient aphorism of man being a social animal, and that is why there is much modern discussion about all of us being socially constructed. It appears then that the human gaze at the universe is culturally tainted. All civilizations, at least all the major ones that we know about, have had their own cosmologies. In addition, the material processes of life, interaction with the universe, in other words, interaction with the universe at the local levels, including the practices necessary for survival and success. So this, global as well as local interaction with the universe continually intermeshed with and gave rise to the process of generating ideas, beliefs, and traditions. The socially constructed and the culturally refracted gaze at the external world also affected the eye that looked inside. The endeavor to understand the world commingled with the endeavor to understand oneself. In other words, the scientific part of the worldview, the part that dealt with the external world, was inseparably amalgamated with the social and the spiritual parts of the worldview. At least such was the case before the arrival of the modern era. Even in the contemporary intellectual atmosphere, there exist attitudes and viewpoints that admire what appears organic and holistic in the pre-modern cultures and civilizations. But civilizations do not leave each other alone. In the long span of history, no civilization has been completely shielded from external interventions and influences. Much as the anthropologist would like to find a pristine culture or tribe that can be studied as a neat example of how worldviews arise and how beliefs and practices cohere to make an organic cultural whole, all cultures and civilization in real life are contaminated. The world does not seem to have been custom made for the anthropologist. The rise and fall of civilizations have happened invariably in interaction with other civilizations. Such interactions have seldom been benign, collaborative, or respectful. Humans have been rather rough with each other. The fact that competition and conflict among civilizations have been major factors behind their rise and fall makes comparisons among them unavoidable. The historian must uncover relative strengths and weaknesses of civilizations if she aims at explaining or at least making sense of the long wave of history. Comparing civilizations, on the other hand, is a troubling subject, and it can create much unease in a civilized mind. Who can say that power and prejudice have not been implicated in such comparisons? Who can say that those who were vanquished were necessarily less evolved and less civilized than the victors? We on the subcontinent have had our own taste of it. Didn't the British who managed to colonize us and had colonized us for obviously other reasons also claim that they had come to civilize us? There was much irony in this, as they also reminded us that we were once a great civilization. We ourselves had forgotten about that. Of course, civilizational comparisons are not needed for explaining every episode in history. Just as a brute ruffian can beat up a thoroughly civilized gentleman, relatively evolved cultures have many a time suffered at the hands of ferocious warrior hordes. But rise and fall of an entire civilization, that's a different matter. They happen across much longer span of time in which many generations and many centuries are involved. They happen They cannot be explained by one accident or one battle. The rise of a civilization must be understood in terms of the long-lasting successes of its way of life and its worldview, and its fall, which at times can be triggered by historical accidents, must be understood as a result of internal decay or due to confrontation with other civilizations. The question I am concerned with in this talk is about the role and relative weight of science in the makeup of a civilization. In the sweepingly broad understanding of it that I mentioned earlier, science emerges from the external gaze humanity casts at the universe, both in the local and in the cosmic arena. This can be conceptually separated from the horizontal gaze through which humans look at themselves as a society, and also from the inner gaze, often described as a spiritual, in which mind looks inward at itself. Our task would become a whole lot easier if we limit ourselves to the case of modern science. In that case, we will be dealing with just one variant of science that arose through the scientific revolution in 17th century Europe. In any case, this is the variant that is dominant now and has attained a singular status in the modern world. Should we so readily accept the hegemony of one specific version of science and relegate all others to the margins? There are controversies galore on that count. I think we have very good reasons to steer clear of those controversies. However, let me briefly touch upon two major critiques that strive to challenge the all-pervasive hegemony of modern science. This would offer some contextual clarity to the arguments I am going to make about the civilizational role of modern science. The first one can roughly be described as the postmodernist critique. Its arguments straddle across multiple academic disciplines, including philosophy, history, sociology, anthropology, even literary theory. At the most basic level, this critique challenges the claim of science to have any special access to external or objective reality. At best, as the argument goes, modern science can merely be one example among many equally legitimate systems of knowledge. We may call it the epistemological relativist position that does not doubt the existence of objective reality outside the human mind, but accords equal status to all different knowledge systems. The argument gathers evidence from history, anthropology, sociology, and many other fields to show that modern science had a very unclean birth, that it arose out of religion and theological debates, superstitious practices such as alchemy and voodoo curative techniques. Right from the time of its birth, it has been implicated in the social structures of power and greed. And on top of it all, the pioneers, fathers of modern science in the early modern era and later, were themselves no models of scientific rationality. They were mired in prejudices and superstitions like everyone else. How can modern science claim any unique access to objective knowledge? But the buck did not stop with epistemological relativism. There came upon the intellectual scene that strong program of sociology and philosophy of science, which had no hesitation in marching all the way to ontological relativism. It put under question mark the existence of objective reality itself. How we see a thing creates that thing. The universe comes into being through our act of looking at it, and hence there are as many universes as there are ways to look at it. At the least, every civilization creates its own universe and its own reality. If the whole gamut of ontology is reduced to an epistemology that is entirely and fundamentally relativist, then what hope and what need for comparing knowledge systems of different civilizations? They are incommensurable, to borrow a famous phrase from Thomas Kuhn, who was no postmodernist, but who has been forcibly and illegitimately roped into the postmodernist project. As for the subject at hand, the rise and fall of civilizations that we are concerned with would be nothing more than the creation of our own concerns. The other such stream is that of the post-colonial theory. It adds historical and political muscle to the philosophical bones of the postmodernist attitude. Modern science is seen as nothing more than a handmaiden of capitalism and imperialism, and an accomplice in the colonial project of the West to subjugate the rest of the world. All tenets of modernity are suspect in the eyes of the post-colonial theorist. I can do no better than quoting a few excerpts from Ashish Nandi, who is among the global gurus of post-colonial theorists. In his famous counter statement on humanistic temper, written in opposition to the statement on scientific temper that had been issued by famous scientists and public intellectuals in 1981, he says, quote, "Science today is big business, and modern Indian scientists are mostly new class of compradors. That to be the subject of such scientists is to be doubly subject to the national and international structures of oppression. The resistance to science in the laity, the common people, the resistance to science in the laity is based on an unconscious awareness of this fact. The common man is not that common after all. Later on, he goes on to say, we must learn to reject the claim to universality of science. Science is no less determined by culture and society than any other human effort. The problem of science springs not merely from its context, but also from its text or content. There is a direct correlation between the claims of absolute objectivity, intersubjectivity, internal consistency, dispassion, and value neutrality, and on the one hand, and violence, oppression, authoritarianism, killing uniformity, death of culture on the other. This was published in Mainstream in 1981, this counter statement. Sorry. Just one second. I ran through. Pardon me, just one second. Yeah, so one can have a lot of issues with the approach and attitude implicit in such critiques of modern science. There is no doubt that science was born out of religion, but does an unclean birth ensure growing up into an undesirable adult? If you pre-decide that looking for the essence of anything is always an illegitimate exercise, and if every conceptual analysis separating the components and disentangling the causalities of a mutually entangled multi-component whole must be disallowed in principle, then of course you may succeed in implicating science in everything that has been happening in the world, including all the crimes of capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism. You may even succeed in convincing some or many that modern science must be forsaken. But what do you gain? What do you propose as an alternate way of life that can do away with modern science altogether? Richard Dawkins once said, quote, show me a cultural relativist at 30,000 feet, and I will show you a hypocrite. Airplanes built according to scientific principles work. One might look around and see if, end quote. Now I'm saying one might look around and see if any alternative science is flying planes, stories about Pushpak Viman notwithstanding. I will readily accept that the unconscious awareness of the laity, Nandi's words, unconscious awareness of the laity has successfully resisted the seeping in of scientific values into the cultural soil of the subcontinent. But has that been a good thing for India or for anyone else? The surprise is not about the laity. It is about those high intellectuals who manage to excavate deep wisdom from every traditionally held belief, prejudice, or superstition. Even if one were to accept all the normative critiques of science, ill-founded as they are, the question about the rise and fall of civilizations and about the role of science in them would not go away. Would it be enough to criticize colonialism and imperialism for what they did and not try to understand why the West became dominant and hegemonic? If we were a more evolved and an ethically superior civilization, how should we have protected it from a few thousand ferocious horsemen or a few thousand clever seafarers? Or shall we just plead that all civilizations, howsoever they may be, should be left alone? There is a story, probably apocryphal, about Archimedes, the great geometer and inventor of the 3rd century BC. When the Romans sacked Syracuse in 212 BC, a brute Roman soldier killed him despite orders to capture him alive. Archimedes was busy brooding over a geometrical figure he had drawn in the sand. He is supposed to have said to the killer who was ready to strike, "Do not disturb my circles." If aided by science, the brutes prevail, shall we tell them, "Do not disturb my civilization"? The start date for the Western domination of world can be put in the middle of 19th century, but the causes behind it were long in the making. The phenomenon, which is known as the Great Divergence, started rather suddenly around 1850. Before that, all the major civilizations and economies of the world had remained for more than a millennium roughly at par with each other in terms of average income, prosperity, or living standards. India and China had been the two largest economies on the planet for nearly 2 millennia till the beginning of the 19th century. Around the year 1700, both these countries accounted for roughly a quarter each of the total world GDP. But the situation turned around in the 150 years after 1820. Around 1970, Western Europe and United States together accounted for nearly half of the world GDP. The shares of India and China had plummeted by then to less than 5% each. Since then, China has climbed back to 16.1%, IMF data in 2018, just behind United States, that is at the top with 23% of the world GDP. India's share continues to languish at a little over 3%. This is the data of 2018. The Great Divergence is variously explained through a combination of factors such as the Industrial Revolution, discovery of the New World, colonial exploitation of India and other countries in the non-West, and internal factors such as innovation, capitalist drive, role of markets as well as of a state intervention, and so on. Such explanations depend on finer weaves of causalities about which one can continue to ask the question, and why did that happen? Large phenomena such as Great Divergence can afford large explanations based on macro level causations, which in turn can provide context for micro causalities and shed light on their origins and sources. The macro causation of Great Divergence in my reading happened through the advent of two large scale phenomena, modernity and capitalism. Other factors such as Industrial Revolution, colonialism, or imperialism were, relatively speaking, derivative phenomena. One cannot say that they all flowed compulsorily from the emergence and unfolding of modernity and capitalism. Even the long wave of history is not entirely deterministic, and it cannot be explained by large causes alone without taking help from smaller causalities and even historical accidents. But my aim here is not to write a history of Europe or to explain why Great Divergence came about. I am taking the example of Great Divergence merely as an indication or a sign that something deep and epoch-making was happening in Western Europe during the half millennium between 14th and 19th century, which in turn unleashed a long-lasting civilizational transformation on a global scale. The whole world is still in the middle of that transformation. The advent of capitalism, of course, is a much discussed phenomenon that is considered as the prime cause behind the Western domination of the rest of the world. Modernity is mostly discussed as an attendant phenomenon of capitalism. Many would go much farther and consider modernity as a superstructural consequence or an ideological tool of capitalism. Of course, a lot depends on how modernity is defined, but it never is a good idea to first pick your definition and then proceed to make your argument according to the chosen definition. What is at stake here is to comprehend the entire beast that emerged from the long-drawn process in the Western Europe during that half a millennium. The beast is sitting in the world today as the proverbial elephant in the room. Emergence of capitalism was a large part of that process, but that does not exhaust it. If one tries too hard to derive from capitalism everything else that happened in Europe during those centuries, it will require too much of theoretical gymnastics. Far more plausible is the thesis that something else too was emerged during those centuries, and that was as important and as powerful as capitalism. This can be comprehended as a constellation of major developments, such as separation of modern philosophy from its theological roots during the 16th and 17th centuries, the advent of scientific revolution in the 17th century, and the emergence and consolidation of the cognitive, cultural, normative, and political values of the 18th century Enlightenment. All these put together represent something that I would call modernity. Such a conception of modernity cannot be contained within an understanding of it as an outcome and as an ideological equipment of capitalism. Capitalism is an example of a system. In the Marxist terminology, for example, it is a mode of production. If you abstract away the system part from social totality, it is not true that there is nothing left. It is also not true that whatever is left as the rest of society can be derived merely as a consequence of the system. In any case, by the time capitalism came in a position to be able to employ in its service a truncated and deformed version of modernity, we were already into the 19th century. Even if we acknowledge that tender sprouts of capitalist relations were beginning to grow in the parts of Europe in 15th or 16th century, capitalism was in no position at that time to shape modernity in accordance with its needs and plans. It could not have employed a Bacon, a Hobbes, a Galileo, a Newton, a Locke, or a Leibniz in its service. A Kant or a Rousseau or a Diderot or a Laplace were yet to emerge on the scene, but when they did, it is not at all clear that all they said was suitable for capitalism, which was yet to come into the driving seat of the world. An obvious doubt can be raised at this point. Are we not reducing the deep plow epochal transformation in the political, social, and civilizational arena in which hundreds of millions of people participated through long centuries to the acts and genius of a select and elite band of philosophers, scientists, and thinkers? This question arises naturally when one tries to deal with large phenomena in history. The key question is, can we identify a large phenomenon clearly enough? It is always a given that everything in history happens through struggles, movements, politics, and campaigns, all arising from the clash of interests. All these generate ideas and strategies for actual transformations. It is a part of the same process of understanding history and drawing lessons from it that one attempts to look at the big picture and decipher deeper and larger causalities. References to ideas, breakthroughs, and pioneers are markers for identifying large phenomena and deciphering deeper causalities. It is often said that things were already in the air before a Newton, Darwin, Marx, or Einstein appeared. That, of course, may be true, but it is also a fact that there is always someone who first points to a thing, and then everyone realizes that the thing was always there. Even after the argument is made that modernity cannot be comprehended merely as a superstructure of capitalism, or for that matter, any other mode of production, the relative weight of capitalism and modernity in the making of what is known as the Western civilization remains an open question. Capitalism, relatively speaking, is far more a tangible entity, and its role in shaping the history of modern world is rather obvious and easily comprehensible. Modernity, in comparison, appears abstract, intangible, and nebulous. But that does not prove that it cannot play a role in shaping history, especially in the long durée, in the long wave of history. It does not prove that it cannot inaugurate and steer a long-lasting and wide-ranging civilizational transformation. In some ways, modernity is akin to religion, although in most ways they are antithetical to each other. Religion has existed in all societies and across varieties of polities, systems, and civilizations. It has always played an important role in the dynamics and flow of history, and yet, most of the time, the role cannot be identified as clearly and as definitely as that of the economy, the nation, the state, or the king. Modernity, by comparison, is very young. It was born out of religion, and yet it has grown to challenge it at philosophical, ideological, and political levels. But despite the antinomies, it also resembles religion. It too has claims to universality, although of a different kind. And it too promises to live like a soul in many different bodies. It too carries potentials for spreading into diverse cultures and societies across the globe. Although the same seeds of modernity may yield very different harvests in different cultural and historical soil. Variations of this theme appear in many scholars who talk about what they call multiple modernities. It has been rather difficult to find what is the essence or the seed of religion. The task may be easier in the case of modernity, but only relatively. A more tractable path may come into view by looking into the role religion has played in major civilizational transformations and how modernity is trying to accomplish something similar in the contemporary world. Let me make use of one such window, which has been called the axial age. Civilizational transformation of that age have often been dubbed as axial transformations. The term axial age was coined by philosopher Karl Jaspers. Through this, he intended to draw attention to a remarkable period in world history spanning half a millennium from 8th century BC to 3rd century BC. This era can be identified with emergence of major world religions and of major civilizations spread across Asia, Middle East, Levant, and the Greco-Roman West. China of Confucius and Lao Tse, India of the Upanishads and Buddha, Zoroastrian Iran, ancient Israel and ancient Greece, and even early Christianity are usually counted among the axial civilizations. Islam was born later, but it too carries characteristics of the axial religions. To contrast, Japan and Korea have been seen as major examples of non-axial civilizations. Christianity proper has also been largely excluded from this category. There have been many controversies around the concept of axial age. Later, scholars have raised questions about the time span, about the historical accuracy of what has been assumed about personalities and events, about supposed commonalities among the civilizations included in the list. A few scholars of Christianity and of Christian theology have been especially critical. One scholar, for example, titled his book, quote, "Convenient Myths, the Axial Age, Dark Green Religion, and the World That Never Was." I suspect there are religious and theological dimensions to many of these controversies. Even within the Greco-Roman part, there are different emphases on the Greco and the Roman components in different scholars. These controversies are not very relevant for my purpose. I am flagging them only to indicate that my arguments do not depend on very hard theses about the axial age. I will stay at the level of qualitative analogies, and that will suffice for my argument. Two core propositions about the axial age caught my attention, and they appear plausible to me. First, all these large and organized religions separated themselves from the earlier local, native, tribal, or in quote, pagan religions by envisioning a transcendental order. Transcendental order for Hindi people, parlokik, the otherworldly. Envisioning a transcendental order separate and removed from the mundane order. The other world removed from this world. The life world has also so in the pre-axial small religions, the transcendental was inseparably mixed up with the mundane. The life world was also the religious world, and the religious practices by and large overlapped with the life practices. The axial religions made a break from that kind of philosophy and practice. The transcendental was envisioned as an entirely separate realm that was irreducibly different from the mundane. And yet the project was to reorder the mundane in the light of the visions about the transcendental. The second defining feature of the axial age was the emergence of a small elite that rose above the masses. This elite, the prophets and the wise men, claimed to have visions of the transcendental, and they led the revolutions to reorder the mundane world on this earth. Let me give a longish but illustrative quote from one scholar of this subject, Shmuel Eisenstadt. He says, quote, "The development and institutionalization of the perception of basic tension between the transcendental and the mundane order was closely connected with the emergence of a new social element. Generally speaking, it was a new type of elite which was cited as the carrier of models of cultural and social order. Examples would include the Jewish prophets and priests, the Greek philosophers and sophists, the Chinese literati, the Hindu Brahmins, the Buddhist Sangha, and the Islamic ulama. It was the initial small of nuclei of such groups of intellectuals that developed the new transcendental conceptions. In all the axial age civilizations, these conceptions ultimately became institutionalized. That is, they became predominant orientations of the ruling elites as well as of many secondary elites, fully embodied in their respective centers and subcenters. One such conception of a tension between the transcendental and the mundane order became institutionalized. It was associated with the transformation of political elites, and it turned the new scholar class into relatively autonomous partners in the major ruling coalitions and protest movements, end quote. For my purpose, I will pick up these two defining features of the axial age civilizations, namely religions with grand philosophies and prophets and philosophers as the supreme ideological leaders. The point to note is that overarching civilizational transformation arose from rather abstract philosophical revolutions that were carried to the masses in accessible forms by the intellectual elite comprising of prophets, philosophers, and other religious leaders. From here, one can return to the question of modernity and the kind of civilizational transformations it is unleashing. There are affinities and homologies that can be discerned. It is not surprising that some scholars consider modernity as the harbinger of a second axial revolution. Staying with the axial age anomaly, one may ask, what constitutes the core and the innermost content of modernity? Remember that we have already separated it from capitalism. Remember also that the emergence of the Western civilization was a combined handiwork of both modernity and capitalism. Emergence of capitalism in Western Europe and its subsequent march on the world are much discussed subjects, and here we are not dwelling on those. Having abstracted an abstract modernity from the history of West, we would like to identify its core content and decipher the processes through which this content got embodied in what usually is identified as the Western civilization. We have identified modernity's birth and consolidation through the three successive phases of what Jonathan Israel has called the revolution of the mind. Actually, Israel uses this phrase only for the period of enlightenment, but I am deploying it in describing the entire period of the modernity revolution. As I have already mentioned, these three phases were separation of philosophy from theology, 16th century, scientific revolution, 17th century, and enlightenment, 18th century. The secularization of philosophy prepared the intellectual atmosphere in which scientific revolution became possible. Some of the philosophers were themselves scientists, although this word scientist came into usage much later. Scientists at that time were called natural philosophers. So some of the philosophers were themselves scientists, mathematicians, and inventors. Bacon, Descartes, and Leibniz can be taken as prime examples. John Locke famously declared himself as a philosophical under-laborer of Mr. Newton. And a little later, Voltaire valiantly combated the intellectual atmosphere in early 18th century France that was stubbornly against Newton. This happened when the era of enlightenment was beginning to rise, largely and primarily on the French horizon, although the Scots, the Germans, and few others too contributed significantly. At the heart of modernity reside the cognitive values generated by scientific revolution. These values consist of a realist ontology, that is, there is a universe out there which exists independent of human ideas about it, and an epistemology that human mind can comprehend objective reality. It can gain objective knowledge through empirical as well as theoretical investigations of the objective world, successively eliminating in the process the contamination of objective knowledge by subjective factors. Easy as it may appear, there was an enormous struggle before these cognitive values could get off the ground. It took a long time before natural philosophy could liberate itself from the ecclesiastical prison house. Some scholars locate the beginning of this intellectual philosophical churning as far back as investiture controversy that started around year 1050 and ended in year 1122 with the Concordat of Worms, and a treaty that was agreed upon by the Pope and the Roman Emperor. The controversy was between them, Pope and Roman Emperor. The controversy was about who had the authority to appoint the bishops, the Pope or the Emperor. The Worms Agreement gave the power to appoint the Pope, but the bishops had to swear allegiance to the Emperor. This was perhaps the first step in the eventual separation of the church and the state. Church became a separate sovereign entity, but it lost its direct political role. Of course, all this took several centuries to take a final shape. We do not have time to go into the details. For us, the important thing to note is that the clear division emerged between the ecclesiastical and the natural philosophical. The Pope had authority over matters related to revelation, and he lost even that authority over a large part of Christianity after Protestantism came into being. And the natural world became the domain of the natural philosopher. For a while, Aristotle, he was long dead, but by Aristotle, I mean his philosophy. For a while, Aristotle, who had been accepted by the church as a part of its effort to claim classical Greek philosophy as its own, mediated when controversies arose between the ecclesiastics and the natural philosophers. But he was dethroned from the mediating chair by both the sides. Eventually, natural philosophy was able to claim complete monopoly over knowledge about nature. Modernity's claim to universality can be defended to the extent that the cognitive value generated by scientific revolution can claim to be universal. This claim arises from the fact that we are all dealing with the same universe. Modern science has hit upon a systematic way to continuously update itself. When new aspects or properties of the universe come into view, modern science immediately gets on with incorporating the new facts into its framework, and occasionally it makes big changes to its own existing framework in the process. On the account of these two large facts, that everyone is dealing with the same physical reality and the same nature, and that there is an open-minded, systematic, and rigorous way to gain knowledge about nature and to continuously upgrade that knowledge. Because of these two aspects, modern science has gained acceptance across cultures and across civilizations. No one has come up with a better alternative. Scientists and other intellectual pioneers of the modern era resemble in some ways the prophets of the axial era, who were the recipients of the revelation. Nature reveals its secrets first to these modern day prophets. Let me call them prophets of the mind. But these prophets are ineffectual in taking their message to the society at large. In ancient times, the same prophets who received the revelation were also good at taking it to the masses. At least that is how the story goes. Instead, the prophets of the mind nowadays need the prophets of culture to spread the secrets and the knowledge to the world at large. The cognitive values must be turned at least partly into cultural values. Science cannot itself become culture, but in some distilled form, it must seep into the layers of culture. That is how modern civilizations have come into being. The reason I have used this phrase, science as a cultural ideal, in the title of this talk is that this phrase I have borrowed from the Norwegian-American thinker Thorstein Veblen, born in 1857 and died in 1927, who wrote in 1906, quote, "The making of states and dynasties, the founding of families, the prosecution of feuds, the propagation of creeds, and the creation of sects, the accumulation of fortunes, the consumption of superfluities, these all have in their time been felt to justify themselves as an end of endeavor. But in the eyes of modern civilized men, all these things seem futile in comparison with achievements of science. They dwindle in the men's esteem as time passes, while the achievements of science are held higher as time passes. This is one secure holding ground of latter-day conviction that the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men is indefeasibly right and good, and no other cultural ideal, this is where the term comes from, and no other cultural ideal holds a similar unquestioned place in the convictions of civilized mankind, end of the quote. In Western Europe, if Galileo, Newton, Locke, Leibniz, and others like them were prophets of the mind at the time of scientific revolution, the fortunate thing for Europe was that they were soon followed by the philosophers and other public intellectuals and thinkers. They were the prophets of culture who inaugurated the European Enlightenment in the 18th century. It is important to note that while the cognitive values of modern science are universal, at least as universal as any knowledge system can be, the same is not true for the cultural values, even after they get modified or permeated by scientific values. This is why it is possible to transmit modern science and its cognitive values across cultures and civilizations, but the European or Western cultural values cannot be imported. In a metaphorical way, we can say that modern science as a seed can be planted in any culture, but the cultural harvest that it will yield will be modified by the cultural soil. The fortunate thing for Europe was that the seed was first discovered or engineered there, and that was also the cultural field where it yielded its first harvest. That is the secret behind the success of Western civilization, resulting in the Great Divergence and in its domination and hegemony over the world. As we move towards the end, let me spend some time with our own culture and civilization. My intention is to try to identify the main barriers to scientific and cultural advancements expected of a civilization that has had such a glorious past. In attempting this, however, I will be even more sketchy than I have been so far. The famous Needham question becomes relevant in this context. Joseph Needham, born in 1900 and died in 1995, the British biochemist who became much better known as a sinologist and historian of science, was intrigued by a question asked by a Chinese student in 1937. Why did the scientific revolution happen in the Western Europe and nowhere else? The question gave decisive turn to Needham's career, and his project, called Science and Civilization in China, became his lifelong project. Between 1954 and at the time of his death in 1995, 15 volumes had been published. The project continues even now, and altogether 27 volumes have been published so far. History of science of no other country not even the countries in Europe where scientific revolution happened, has been subjected to such extensive and thoroughgoing investigation. It is difficult to answer the negative part of the Needham question. Why did it not happen elsewhere? It is easier to describe something that happened rather than something that did not happen. China, India, and the Muslim world were the three prime examples where scientific revolution could have happened. China is the best known example, not only because it found a Needham, but also because it was the most advanced non-European civilization scientifically and technologically until the onset of the modern era. Our concern, however, is with the Indian subcontinent. Ancient India has had its scientific and mathematical achievements extending up to the beginning of the second millennium. Even though India is yet to find its Needham and much of the treasure of its accomplishments may yet to be excavated, one can still marvel at the civilizational precociousness and remarkable achievements. We have, for example, excuse me, we have, for example, the Nasadiya Sukta in the 10th mandal of Rigved, composed perhaps around 1200 BC, a marvelous example of deep, open-minded and skeptical wonderment about cosmology and the origin of the universe. It opens with the famous line, Nasadasino sadasit danim nasi drajo no vyoma paroyat. I wanted to read it in Sanskrit because, many of you may not have heard it, Translation, then there was neither existence nor non-existence. There was no air then, nor the space beyond it. And at the end of this thing, I can add, in the last pad says that, who knows, maybe even he doesn't know who all created it, supposedly created it. So, an example of supreme skepticism and open-mindedness in 1200 BC, we had that. On the more mathematical side, we have the Shulva Sutra from the 9th century BC that contains, among other things, the Pythagoras theorem. This was centuries before Pythagoras. Irrational numbers were known to ancient mathematicians, including the value of pi to 5 decimal places. Diophantine equations were known to those who wrote the Bodhayan and the Apastam Sutras of the Krishna Yajurved around 1000 BC. In the classical age, of which Gupta period in the first half of the first millennium AD was the pinnacle, we had Aryabhatta, who had the heliocentric theory almost 1,000 years before Copernicus. Romila Thapar writes, quote, Aryabhatta in AD 499 was the first astronomer to tackle the more fundamental problems of the new studies. He calculated pi to 3.1416 and the length of the solar year to 365.358686805 days. Both remarkably close to recent estimates. He believed that Earth was a sphere and rotated on its axis, and that the shadow of the Earth falling on the moon caused eclipses. End of quote from Professor Thapar. One could go on and on. There is much in our history to be genuinely proud of. But all this further underlines the question, why did we miss out on the scientific revolution? We had the gems, the scattered accomplishment of our ancestors, but why didn't we have the crown? That is the full-bodied scientific revolution that could continue ever after. We have a few gems here and there in the post-classical period, but largely there is darkness, scientifically speaking, for more than a millennium. Suddenly, the modern pioneers appear in the late colonial period, about whom we talked about at the beginning of this talk. As I said, we need our own Needham to answer that question. But we can notice one conspicuous coincidence. The 1,000 years between 7th, 8th century and the 17th, 18th century is also the period of the Bhakti movement. This movement charted out a plebeian road to God, consisting of numerous pedestrian paths of divine love, devotion, and surrender, paths that reverberated with the enchanting devotional songs of the Bhakti poets. These saint poets composed and sang in the local vernacular languages. They came from all castes, and there were notable women poets too. These devotional streams inundated the religious and the cultural mindscape of the entire subcontinent. This millennial phenomenon had its origin in the Tamil region in 7th, 8th century with the Alvar and Nayanar saints and the saint poets such as Namalwar and Andal. My pronunciation may be wrong. Andal was a woman saint poet. The philosophical foundations for the Bhakti movement were offered during the 11th and 12th centuries by philosopher saints from the Vedanta school of Hinduism, such as Ramanuja, Madhva, Vallabha, and Nimbarka, all of them descending from the Advait Vedanta school of Adi Shankaracharya in 9th century, and all branching out with philosophical and theological differences. Over a period of nearly 1,000 years, the movement spread to all parts of the subcontinent. Basava and Akka Mahadevi in Kannada, 12th century, Ramanand, who came from south but lived in North India and created his own sect in 14th century, Namadev and Tukaram, 17th century in Marathi, Kabir, Surdas, Ravidas, Mirabai, and Tulsidas in Hindi dialects, 15th and 16th centuries, Nanak, Dadu, Nabhadas, 15th and 16th century Punjab, Jayadev, Sanskrit poet from 12th century, and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, 16th century in Bengal. The list is a very long one. Bhakti movement has been credited with numerous grand achievements. It was a massive resistance against Vedic, Brahminical, Sanatani, Varnashrami, Sanskritist, and elitist Hinduism. It was a veritable social and cultural rebellion against the caste system. It devoured the remnants of Buddhism in India, incorporated the Jains, Sufis, and many other smaller religions and sects into its fold. And most importantly, it is spread over the entire subcontinent as a very thick carpet of plebeian religiosity. All the saints, poets, and leaders of the uncountable sects were not untouched by politics, but their devotees and followers lived their life immersed in the river and the seas of devotion, largely detached from the politics of the day. The roving saint poets, singing in dozens of vernacular languages, stitched the innumerable cultural patches of the subcontinent into a quilt of one civilization. Even when the subcontinent was politically fragmented, which most of the time it was, the cultural civilizational unity was never in serious question. Bhakti movement had played a stellar role in bringing this about. Even after the era of Bhakti poets came to a gradual close during the 18th and 19th century, Bhakti maintained, and it still maintains, a strong presence on the subcontinent. Even the anti-colonial national movement adopted Bhakti-based cultural integration of the subcontinent as an argument for a unified and sovereign nation state. As one scholar of Bhakti movement puts it, quote, "The British largely told the story of their country's rise to power in India as a benevolent alternative to a weakened Mughal state. Both regimes were foreign in origin, imposing themselves almost necessarily over the weak, balkanized mass that was India itself. Nationalist historians could not accept this. They required a sense of the medieval that gave indigenous coherence to this crucial period, even if its political impact was less than clear. Not only must it serve as a realm that could be interpreted as resisting a rule that was ultimately foreign, in bracket, some granted that the Mughals eventually became quite domesticated. It had to have sufficient internal coherence to give birth to, at the same time, to a distinctly indigenous modernity. It had to presage the independent Indian state and prepare its way. Appropriately narrativized, Bhakti could do this job. And without overly alienating Indian Muslims, many of whom could be seen as forming part of the broader Bhakti domain. After all, it was India, and especially Indian Bhakti, that made Indian Islam so different from what was to be seen in the Middle East, end quote. This is a quote from John Stratton Howley, A Storm of Songs, India, an Idea of Bhakti Movement, published by Harvard University in 2015. All this may be true, and yet there is no need to look or relook at the big picture of the Bhakti movement. And yet there is need to look or relook at the big picture of the Bhakti movement. What have been its millennial consequences, and what kind of impact has it had on the modern history of the subcontinent? Here I am not talking of the conflicts and strife that had internally plagued the movement. I am not engaging with the differences between the Nirgun and Sagun streams. I am not raising the question whether the entire Bhakti movement can be seen as a progressive movement against caste and patriarchy and against religious sectarianism and fundamentalism. My concerns are about the overall persona of the Indian civilization, which does have some imprint of classical Hinduism and also of rigid structure of other religions, but which has been largely constructed after the end of the classical period, in which this Bhakti movement has played the dominant role. In my opinion, Bhakti movement can be seen as an example of a counter-axial counter-revolution. Remember my reference to, that is why I brought this subject of axial revolution, led by high philosophy and great prophets. In my opinion, Bhakti movement can be seen as an example of a counter-axial counter-revolution. It put an end to the theological, philosophical debates of the Upanishadic, Buddhist, and the classical era, and stifled the chances of emergence of rigorous and robust philosophical tradition from the womb of religion and theology. It completely roadblocked what is known as Gyan Marg, the knowledge road. The prophets of cognition, resembling the ancient prophets of revelation, could not have been born in a land permeated by bhakti. And the prophets of culture, who took the message to the masses, were mostly preachers of devotion, faith, and mystic experiences. Those who think that oppressions by the caste system, patriarchy, and other archaic social systems survive only because of Vedic Brahmanism or classical Hinduism would also need to look at what Bhakti movement has accomplished for these struggles and what kind of civilization it has bequeathed us. I do not claim to have an answer to the Needham question for India, but it appears plausible to me that Bhakti movement has been the largest obstacle in the process of cognitive values of science seeping into the cultural soil of India. Science cannot be accepted as a cultural ideal in a society and in a culture that is so steeped in bhakti. It may appear as if I am concluding on a very pessimistic note. What does a farmer gain by cursing the soil? We are a civilization that has thick cultural layers deposited over centuries and millennia. If one points to the hard subterranean plates which are not welcoming to the seeds of science and modernity, isn't this equivalent to throwing up one's hands in despair? But I hope you will see that what I am saying is not pessimistic at all. Realistically and honestly analyzing the past to deeply understand the present is essential for visionary and creative plans for the future. India is not the only country that is beset with the kind of problems I have touched upon. The whole world, including the Western world, where science and modernity were born, are in the middle of this second axial revolution. Nobody is out of the woods yet. It is the same India that had the early pioneers of modern science, whom I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. It is the same India that gave rise to someone like Jawaharlal Nehru, a rare example of a leader and a statesman so clear-headed, who was so clear-headed about science and modernity, and also about what India is as a civilization. It is the same India that successfully defeated colonialism and established itself as a sovereign modern republic. Perhaps I may also clarify that what I'm saying is not a substitute for the critique of capitalism or of the current system. Those oppressed and exploited by the system will continue to fight and continue to devise strategies for that fight. What I have discussed here is complementary to the discussion about how to fight capitalism and its political and economic structure. Actually, the axial kinds of revolutions are the overarching umbrellas under which political revolutions against existing systems can take place as and when they do. I think I should stop here and see what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ravi, for this exhaustive presentation. And first of all, I request Professor Parvez Hudboy, who is with us, is a leading physicist and human rights activist, to give some initial comments, to say a few words about, give an initial comment. Please, Parvez, please, unmute. You're muted, Maya.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, please.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, that was quite a tour de force and very relevant, because every society now measures itself according to how modern and how scientifically progressed it is. And so we see peoples of all cultures trying to prove the superiority of their culture by saying that, oh, we did this and we did that in the past. But Ravi, I think, has very properly pointed out that there's only one world, and so far as we know, there's only one way of getting to know it, and that is through modern science and the vast apparatus it has developed for that purpose. That apparatus being both theoretical and in terms of the instrumentation. There is, and it makes a lot of sense, after all. Ravi quoted Dawkins, I think, who said that if you're flying at 30,000 feet, you know that there's a shock wave underneath your plane's wing. That shock wave was predicted by the laws of fluid dynamics, which is what made flying in that plane possible. Now, there is no other way that anyone has ever invented of flying at 30,000 feet other than using the laws of physics. Yes, we are all proud of our ancient cultures. Actually, I think we shouldn't be proud of that. I think we should be proud of the fact that we are humans endowed with rational faculty. And it is the fact that we can think and observe that ultimately led to the scientific method. That scientific method is the one with which we have uncovered the deep mysteries of nature. Yes, it is true that we have on this subcontinent people who have been very great scientists, some in the far past, but more recently people like C.V. Raman and Satyendranath Bose and Chandrasekhar, Khorana, etc., and Abdul Salam. Now, these were scientists who worked within the framework of modern science. They did not, although they were very proud culturally of having their roots in a land which had many overlays of culture upon it. Nevertheless, They took the science which was developed in Europe, which came with the colonizers, and of course they didn't always have a happy relationship with the colonizers. They always felt a bit resentful, even socially, but they never tried to invent any kind of science which was not grounded in what had been discovered earlier, that is to say, in the last 400 years. It's very important for us to realize, and particularly I won't say it's more important here in Pakistan than in India, but it's certainly very important for me to keep stressing to my students, to people around, that no holy book has ever given you the mechanism for creating a machine, doing an experiment, or even creating some kind of a theory which is testable. Yeah, every religion has holy books, and there are references made to natural phenomena over there, and some people take them very seriously. People get the Big Bang out of the Quran or the Vedas or the Bible or the Torah or whatever. But when it comes down to actually testing, well, then what we need is proof. And then I'm afraid those are just stories that you get from all the holy books. There is one and only one way of knowing the physical universe. I'm not talking about life after death, or if there's a rebirth or no rebirth, or what you will get once you die and you go upstairs, if there's an upstairs or whatever. I think the other thing that Ravi raised, and which is very significant, is the Needham question. The question of why is it that the scientific revolution happened in Europe and didn't happen elsewhere? Well, of course, it may have, if colonialism hadn't happened, if native cultures had been allowed to develop without being imposed upon from outside, maybe there would have been a revolution over the millennia. We don't know. But looking at the diffusion of science today, so here I'm not speculating, I'm saying looking at the diffusion of science today, we see that those cultures which are more accommodative, which have within them cultural flexibility, do way, way better. And I could give you so much evidence of that. So if you have people, if you have a culture that does not allow intrusion of influence, intellectual influence from outside, well, that culture then atrophies. It becomes stagnant. And well, if I look at Islamic culture, which I'm more familiar with than with the Hindu culture, the time that it did really well was when it was able to accommodate Greek culture between the 9th and the 13th century. And it did very well in those 4 centuries. And then when it developed within itself a resistance to that, after that it's been all the way downhill. I can't think of any major scientific work that has been done by Muslims in the last 800 years. And I keep telling that to people here in Pakistan. You just got to know the fact that science is universal. Humans are endowed with a rational faculty. We are humans. And faith then must not be allowed to intrude into matters of epistemology, into knowledge of the physical universe. You can think about any kind of metaphysics that you want, but the fact is that if you want to get to the truth, you have to use the method of science, and there's no other way around that. So I think Ravi did a great job, and I'll stop over here.
Ravi, would like to say something?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ravi, for this
No,
great sweep of a great sweep and looking at the civilizations and how they failed, and very thought-provoking lecture. We have uh, several questions and comments in chat box too, and there are also some of people whom we also may want to call for commenting. Maybe we can start with taking some few comments that are available in chat box right now.
Bhargav, I'm just asking Ravi too if he wants to make some comments about, say something about Ravi's.
no, I am fine, Subhash.
Yeah, please.
Parvez, of course, it was great, I mean, very typical of Parvez. He summarized the whole thing so well. So I have nothing to add to that. It was super what he said. I fully agree.
Yeah, please. Bhargav, please, sorry.
Yeah. It's not a question, but there is a comment which may be directly relating to your take on Indian culture by Siddhartha Chatterjee. He mentions that according to Acharya P.C. Ray, author of History of Hindu Chemistry, the concept of Maya, propounded by, of course, Shankaracharya, may have also held back the development of science and technology in India. So this comment is there.
Well, I mean, I could agree with Acharya Ray. He was a great chemist, but also he was very knowledgeable about Indian philosophy and Indian cultural intellectual history. But the level at which I am trying to look at the problem, for that it is not necessary to go into details of, I mean, all the details about different parts of Indian tradition, Indian philosophical tradition, and so on. I have not gone into that kind of micro picture deliberately, because when you go into that micro picture, often the macro picture you miss out on. And today my concern was a very sweeping glance on history of several thousand years and comparing that with the history of several thousand years in some other cultures. So when you try to do something like that, it will necessarily be sketchy, hand waving. More it is that what appears plausible to me and how I can make a plausible thesis about why we have landed, our civilization has landed in this situation. So I will not go into that kind of detailed questions. I may not even be knowledgeable about every detailed question about Indian philosophy, but whatever little I know, I haven't marshaled even what I know into the argument that I am making. I am making the argument at a different level.
There is one more question posed by one Mr. Kishore. He is bluntly asking, why can't we be Europeanist and forget the question where it all came from? I mean, learn from European philosophy and attempt to solve our question.
Bhargav, you spoke too fast. I could not follow. Can you read slowly?
Yes. Mr. Kishore is asking, why can't we be Europeanist and forget the question where it all came from? I mean, learn from them, European philosophy, and attempt to solve our question.
Well, that is easier said than done. You can't tell even much simpler things to whole of India. How can you tell whole of India to become Europe or learn from Europeans? That is a much more difficult proposition. That is why I said that everybody will be forced to import science, but nobody should be compelled to import culture. So science can come to every culture and give rise to a better culture that will use and respect the what I call cognitive values of science, namely scientific method and scientific ways of knowing. So that is the best thing. We should import science. We should not import culture. Cultures are created through thousands of years, and you cannot import something from elsewhere and plant in some other soil. Cultures can't be replanted. Science can be planted.
I think we have with us Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed. I'd request him to say a few words. Then two friends have raised their hands and we'll invite them. But Professor Ishtiaq Saab is there, so he was there two months back in the Democracy Dialogue series. Ishtiaq Saab, please. You're mute. You're mute, sir. You're mute. Please unmute yourself.
Mute my
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was away in Pakistan all this while, and I'm glad I'm back. And I heard Ravi and then Pervez speak so much wisdom and do it so well. The thing is, I'm in total agreement with these two colleagues of mine. I was just wondering, Pervez makes a distinction between the physical world and the spiritual world, but there is the social world where I think the relationship between culture and science needs to be problematized. I think if I understand it correctly, the argument should be that although science can be introduced anywhere because of its universal method and the way it proffers evidence and so on, it is equally important to look at cultures and see how much of them are amenable to incorporating the scientific spirit. Therefore, culture is a problem, I think. So romanticizing culture or dividing culture from science may be unrealistic. So this contradiction between culture and science also needs to be theorized and explained. What needs to be done in our cultures to make the scientific spirit acceptable to the, Pervez would surely support me, and I'm sure the same is the case in India. There is a tendency to go back and seek scientific method and so on in our own ancient past, which I think is a lot of romanticization of our civilizations. And maybe the problem is that science came along with a triumphant Western society, so it has a different context in which it has grown. Whereas science was imposed through the colonial order, so there is a emotional need, some sort of psychological resistance to accepting science as the way forward to change the world and then move on and so on. I think we need to look at Indian and Islamic and Pakistani, South Asian cultural resistance to the scientific spirit. A few individuals having done it, and that's not enough. I think we lack a general acceptability to, logical argument, to emphasis on evidence and so on, and people tend to get easily attracted to mystification and romanticization of our past and the glories attached to it. So that's my only concern, that the social world is still a problem in how to import or implant the scientific spirit. So culture may not be, may need, I think, along with the scientific system, a cultural form of a new culture also comes along with it. And unless it does that, it will only produce a few individuals and leave the rest of the society unmoved and more or less left on the side. That's the feeling I get. So that's all I have to say.
I I agree with what Ishaq Sahab is saying. And some of the things that I wanted to say, there was no time to say that or to write it down. The way I kind of describe it is that there is this external gaze on the world at large from which science comes. And there is this absolutely inner gaze, which is often called spiritual, that we deal with ourselves. But then there is this horizontal gaze where we deal with each other. And that is what Ishtiaq Sahab is pointing, that this horizontal gaze, this social dimension, that is at times a much larger determining factor in any culture, and that has to be looked at it. And I did not have time to go into, this is a deep and large question, and Ishtiaq Sahab is more of an expert on those things than I am. But my take is that when a culture, when a given culture is not very receptive to science, and everybody has to become receptive to science sooner or later. That is the universality argument that Parvez put it so well, So everybody has to become receptive. And yet when a culture is not receptive to science, that is where the social dimension comes into picture. And in present day world, that kind of cultural transformation, the preparation of the cultural ground for reception of science, is done politically. There is no escape from politics. Only politics can make interventions in the society at the immediate level in such a way that cultural transformations happens to the extent that that society becomes receptive to science. So for example, in India, I mentioned at the end that it is fortunate that Jawaharlal Nehru was there. It is fortunate that large part of the national movement was fired up by, modern views, modern political and cultural views. It is a fortunate thing that we in India have a modern constitution and a republic, which is right now under threat. Right now, people are trying to dismantle it. But that is what will create the state, this modern state, modern system, modern politics. That is what will, if done properly, will prepare the cultural soil in India for receiving science better than it has. That is why, I'm sorry to say that, I respect all those people who are engaged in people science movements, and that does good work, and yet you cannot change the cultural soil of India for science by these experiments of taking science to people. That is a political task. The society gets affected by politics more than anything else. And then a cultural climate arises in which you can be rational and you can be scientific. So I did not have the time to go into that, but politics is the key. And right now in India, there is a big threat to whatever we have achieved. Right now, India has become much more resistant to science and reason than it was in the period of Nehru, when it was much less educated and much less fed. That's the tragedy we are faced with. But that part I did not cover in this talk deliberately.
Mr. Kishore has raised his hand. Can you please unmute yourself and
No, I had lovely talk. I mean, Ravi, it was fantastic to engage and to learn from you. I only one clarification. I had asked the question about why can't we be Europeanist and learn. So I'm not saying or suggesting that we should adopt that culture. And we meaning here, I'm saying that in contention, we can be anybody. We have to decide what do we mean by we. But I was saying that I wanted to clarify that it's not cultures that, but some of the philosophical arguments in European philosophy have advanced far more because they had the infrastructure. That's all. Why I don't know, but they had. I mean, including the linguistic turn within philosophy, and starting from Marx, Derrida, and Spivak, and all these people, and including the women's question. The So I'm just suggesting that we could, I mean, learn from European philosophy that way, not the European culture, but that was my yeah, that's all.
Thank you. I agree. I agree with you. I mean, that is, science is the clearest example that can be imported. But as I said, it just so happened that Europe is also the example where modern philosophy separated itself from theology that was much rooted in culture, and modern philosophy that was closer to modern science. So if they managed to do that, why should we not learn from that? We may not adopt everything from their modern philosophy. We will have to adopt everything in modern science. We don't have to adopt everything in philosophy, but there is a large chunk of modern philosophy that we can adopt and we can learn from. Thank you.
I request Manisha has also raised her hand. Manisha, I asked Manisha ji to unmute herself and.
Yeah. Hello, hi everyone. It was a wonderful talk, and I'm still like processing a lot of things. It will take time to understand. I don't know how relevant this question is, but I was just reading this one article other day that how the far right threat to is the rise of the far right is threat to the liberal democracy even in Europe, because what the problem we are facing here in our country, it's just not about us. It's becoming slowly a global phenomena, many part of the world. And what Ravi was saying, like all those places of the world which were in a way those soils origin of science. So what exactly happens that all those very scientifically, temperament in a culture, in society and people, they are also going back in that direction. And what's happening like everywhere, not only with us.
There is a wave of reaction going on in the world. I think this is a reaction to the end of the ideological divide in the world between the Soviet model and the capitalist model, and with the Soviet gone, socialism no longer making the same appeal. I think we are lost in finding a way back to some rational internationalism that we can go forward with, culturally speaking, and incorporating science. That's how I would imagine the predicament of our times.
Yes, and still Manisha's question is very good, and I agree with Istiaq Sahab, but I will also add that, the percolation of science into the cultural soil is a millennial task. And that is why I said that nobody is out of the woods. Where science was created, those societies also, science has not percolated into all layers of their cultural, universe. So one part is that. The other part is which was not the topic of today, but that it is related, so I will mention it. Sometimes there are ironies in the way history progresses. In India, we find that democracy has come. Democracy is a modern value. Democracy is, many people will claim, necessary for even scientific culture to thrive. So who can argue against democracy? Nobody has an alternative to democracy. And yet, democracy is creating havoc in India. Forgive me for saying so. No, right. I hope you will understand that. Democracy is undoing itself. And democracy, when there is competitive democracy, And when the players in the political field are allowed, they are doing whatever it takes to win, no holds bar, then they dig out things from the civilizational cultural mind which are very problematic. Now, can the way in Rwanda, Hutus can be incited to butcher Tutsis, or the other way? No, Hutus can be, the majority can be incited to butcher Tutsis. The way in India, Hindus are being incited as if, now after 1,000 years, Hindu rule has come, and that Hindu rule depends on traumatizing the minorities. Where was that sitting? That was sitting in the Indian mind, but it was not active. And this democracy has made it active. So it is a very troubling question. When we don't have an alternative to democracy, and yet democracy somehow is playing in the hands of the right wing. And that is happening in other parts of the world too. I don't have an answer to that question, but I am very troubled by that. I think that no one can escape that question. I don't want to run away from that question, even if I don't have an answer to that question.
Please.
Yeah. There is a question posed by Alok Tandon. He says there is a counter thesis that it was the caste system which divided intellectual work from manual work is behind modern science not emerging on India. Your response. And there is a supplementary question. More important is another question. What does your thesis imply for cultural politics of the country at present?
Well, I am sure I am no expert of history, but I am sure that the caste system for which India is known all over the world impacted on every aspect of our social life. I have no doubt about that. So I agree with whoever says that caste system would have played a role in at least partly obstructing some geniuses in India, some part of Indian mind from flourishing. I agree with that. But then if you take it that is the sole reason why India could not have scientific revolution, or if you say that caste system is the sole reason for all the other very widespread ills of India, very deeper civilizational crises that we go through, then I am not convinced by putting all the explanatory eggs in the caste basket. So I partly agree with that question, but that does not answer the absence of scientific culture from India altogether. Cultural politics, what comes out of it? I said, always we have to remember that at what scale we are doing our thinking. If we are trying to understand something very deep and very broad that has happened over thousands of years, you should not expect that immediately that analysis will yield an action plan that must be implemented at the level of days and months and years. So that today's topic was more like the background under which politics should be visualized. And there are, I did not write it up and I didn't have time to go into this background question is being discussed in this way because this sheds light on how politics need to be re-envisioned on the Indian soil. Because there is, as I would say, and again, forgive me for saying that, there is a lot of simplistic explanations, hand-waving explanations. There is a lot of dogmatism. And at the same time, there is a lot of populism. And everybody seems to have solution to everything. And as I always say, if everybody has a solution to a problem, then be sure that that problem is nearly intractable or very difficult. So it's a it's a difficult thing. Only thing I would say that everything feeds into the politics of the day to day. Today, the battle lines are being drawn in India. And this kind of analysis sheds light on the battle lines that are being drawn in India, which side you are on. There is a side which will offer, what do you call these handsets, these smartphones, which will offer smartphones in every hand. And then through using those smartphones, it will take everyone to the Stone Age. That is what is happening in India. So you have to see that, that is the combination of Hindu Rashtra plus Vikas. Vikas is smartphones in every hand, but Hindu Rashtra is taking you to the Stone Age. And that is what has become a practical challenge in our society. And people who are doing finer analysis, of systems and classes and so on, they are not realizing that the question is much larger. That there is one dividing line right now, not multiple dividing lines. And that applies to left movement, that applies to social movements. Each one of us in the left and in the social movement are expert at creating new dividing lines and fighting across those small, splintering dividing lines, whereas the fight is, across a very broad, one very dangerous dividing line. Thank you.
There are many questions in the chat box, but I will request Srinivas Bulusu. He has raised his hand to speak. Unmute yourself and please.
Yeah. Good evening, Professor Sinha. It's very nice. I mean, again, we have gone through your insights into the Bhakti movement, the effect of Bhakti movement. I have two questions. Like one is you talked about the counterintuitive revolution for the axial age. Do you want to see the Islamic and the Christianity development of or spread of Christianity and Islamic corollary to the Bhakti movement in India? First question. And second question, are we again in the new age of Bhakti movement following the second axial age?
Yeah, there was another question. It relates to that in the chat box. I think, just I glanced at it, that what was Needham's answers to the China puzzle? Why did it not? I will not, and I haven't paid a detailed attention to that. Same way, I haven't paid detailed attention to the Islamic world, which was the most developed part of humanity, as Parvez writes in his book, between 19th and 13th century. And yet what happened there, I don't find myself qualified to make a comment on that. But about our own society and about the Bhakti movement, I am clearer that it is something that is opposite of what I extract from desirability of axial kind of revolutions. And those axial revolutions, it is a matter of attitude. It is a matter of political attitude. Those axial revolutions, they arise in the elite, and then they come down under the leadership of that elite and percolate into the soil. This is anathema to the other political attitude, which says that everything arises from the masses, from below. And if something has not spontaneously or naturally arisen from the masses, and that it is very anti-elitist, I call that populist, So there is a tension there that Bhakti movement, I find, as a clear example of this, this keeping philosophy very pedestrian, easily transmissible to the people, merging with the people, and making that philosophy easily acceptable through songs and theologies, to the people. So this is very different from religions which had books or prophets, or where the transcendental realm was separate and abstract and nothing like the mundane world. That separation which was defining feature of axial revolution, Bhakti movement I see as an antithesis of that. So Bhakti movement, there could not have been a grand philosophy in Bhakti movement, and there could not have been an elite leadership, that could have a larger vision and then struggle to take that vision to the people. That is what my political attitude is, and I think that the visions are creations of the elite, and revolutions are made by people under those visions.
Kumar Ketkar Saab is here with us. I request Kumar Saab to please say a few words.
And Subhash Akhilesh is also.
Akhilesh has also raised his hand, and Anand has also raised his hand. Yeah, please. Kumar
Well,
Saab.
actually, Ravi, it was just fantastic and profound. So my question or my narrative or my statement may look like rambling, but even then, whatever it is worth. I have not understood, it is not my question, it is Richard Feynman's question, is despite such a fantastic cultural achievement in Europe and also scientific achievement, how could it go through what happened in Germany in concentration camps when Germany was at the peak of culture as well as science? And the same thing in European wars. It clearly showed that despite cultural and scientific evolution, they could not control the kind of nationalism and fascism which led to wars. So, what is the relationship of cultural evolution to these human conflicts? And second point, J.D. Bernal wrote Science in History, and that also covered some part of it, but it did not so much. And third simple point is the question that you raised was also raised by C.P. Snow in his great lecture, even about nearly 90 years ago. My simple point is, was the social question which was mentioned by Iqbal Saab actually related to the production question that Karl Marx always mentions? It is the production relations and productive technique that actually matters in evolution of society, science as well as culture. Both science and culture are products of the production relations and productive techniques and production systems. I mean, this is very rambling kind of a thing, but because you did not mention, I think, Haldane and J.D. Bernal, I thought I must mention. That's all. Nothing. This is no comment on the speech. It was absolutely fantastic and brilliant.
No, Kumar Sahab, what you raise is very important. It's not rambling at all. And it just so happens that I did not dwell on that part. I just said that I am not going to talk about capitalism. And I said that whatever happened in Western Europe was a combined handiwork of both capitalism and modernity. And I agree with Marx. I consider myself a Marxist, whatever understanding I have of it, that in the long wave of history, the production relations play the dominant role. I abstracted away from that question for the simple reason that if you use that method or that theoretical strategy that you want to derive everything from production relations, then it seems that we create more trouble for ourselves than answering questions. And that I don't think Marx meant that. Marx wrote very cryptically about this very long wave things, 2-3 paragraphs in his 1859 books and so on. This whole theory of history. The way I have convinced myself that, first of all, I have to ask the question that why is religion so long lasting? Why is religion in every society, in every ages, changes have happened, and religions, there are different religions, and yet this thing is common, that religion has always been there, and it looks like, it is all pervasive. And how do I explain religion starting from the economic base of production relations? So there must be many more things happening. And that is how the way religion, I don't see, and Marx has not explained religion based on production relations either. When he wrote about religion, that was very wise and beautiful poetry. when he wrote, the last line of those was that religion is the opium of the masses. But you should read the whole, one should read, I'm sure you have, but one should read the whole passage. That is beautiful, that is wise, that is deep, but that is no theory of religion. If you say that Marx gave theory of religion in that beautiful, wise, deep paragraph, then I don't agree. So we don't have a Marxist theory of religion. And same way, we don't have a Marxist theory of modernity, modernity that I abstracted away from capitalism, from system. So we are in the midst of a lot of questions that still need to be answered, and that is not a bad thing. That is how science develops. About the German thing, about what Hitler and so on, I think Marxists and others have been rather unthinking hurry to blame fascism and Nazism, blame modernity for fascism and Nazism. A lot of literature was created in there. And even from the Marxist side, there was that pessimistic Marxist theorist of the Frankfurt School, who opened the door, Pandora's box, in explaining. I am no theorist and I am no expert, but I always try to make rough sense for myself of everything. And the way I understand is that this philosophical undercurrent that finally emerged as Hitler, that philosophical undercurrent from the very beginning was opposed to modernity. The seeds, philosophical seeds, whether Hitler was educated himself enough to know that or not, but the philosophical underpinnings of Nazism and of Hitler goes not to the modernist philosophers of the liberal kind, not to Locke and Kant and so on. It goes to the romantic stream that was very peculiar to German philosophy and continental philosophy. And that then develops finally into Heidegger, who twisted and turned after fall of Hitler, but who had no problem living there, under Hitler, and that Heidegger is a darling of many of the post-structuralist, postmodern thinkers, So though there are very troubling undercurrents that led to Hitler, modernity cannot be blamed for Hitler. It happened in the modern period. It happened through modern politics. It happened due to how the geopolitics of the world was playing out. It happened through whatever had happened politically inside Germany. It happened through that ultra-nationalism that came about, after Germany was defeated in the First World War. So I'm not saying that nothing about it was modern, but the way I am visualizing modernity as a philosophical entity is abstracted away from the system part, capitalist part and feudal part and so on, or socialist part and so on. In that understanding, the philosophical undercurrent of Hitler does not go to modernity. It goes to romantic streams. So that is where I will stop. Yeah.
Anand has raised his hand. Anand, please unmute yourself and see. Anand,
Yeah,
please.
thank you very much, Ravi, for an excellent presentations. Activists like us are hardly ever exposed to such a broad and scholarly, but yet politically oriented sort of presentation on at the global level. And in the end, you came back to India, and at the very end, your comment about the current political and cultural milieu being anti-science. So I think very pertinent politically. So I think it was a very good learning experience. There are two small points that I would like to make. Professor Gamba Sardar, I think Subhash Gatade knows about him, was a Marxist scholar on Santa Parampara. And he pointed out, this is not at all any comment on your lecture, but I thought that this particular point I did not see in your talk because of lack of time very clearly, is that he pointed out that he was a great appreciator of the Santa Parampara. And he pointed out that the equality that the Sants talk about, Tukaram was the revolutionary saint, was primarily, inevitably, was primarily at the level of access to God. ईश्वर के सामने सब समान है. That is his teaching, and even that itself was a great revolution. We are not alone, but the whole Santa Parampara. That was the message, and that was very popular, etc., etc. It spread across and created certain grounds for equality. But what he points out as a Marxist is that all this remained at the level of cultural, at the level of ideas, at the level of at the cultural level. In material reality, the caste system was as tightly bound as it was, and there was absolutely like take the Dalits for example, remained outside what we call Gaukus, which is the main thing. The untouchability continued, child marriages, everything, ban on inter-caste marriage, everything continued. And the Santa Parampara in those particular days did not make any difference and could not have made any difference on all this. But it created a ground. And with the advent of commodity production with the British Raj, whatever changes that have taken place have also, I think, partly because of the tradition of the Santa Parampara. So I suppose this materialist analysis of Santa Parampara, I think needs to be pointed out. I think probably you would all, if you had time, you would have pointed this out. But I think this your talk reminded me of Professor Gamba Sardar. Secondly, the point that is being made, and this has been reinforced by one Mr. Pasha, who is a Muslim, who is not exactly a professor, but a very scholarly activist. In his recent talks, he has been pointed out, I think even Gamba Sardar pointed out, that the Sufi Parampara created grounds for Santa Parampara in Maharashtra. So it precedes by a few centuries. And in that way, there is this kind of a positive relationship between Sufi Parampara and Santa Parampara, and that created grounds for whatever Renaissance that took place after the British. Primarily, of course, the colonial push and the commodity production, but also because of the earlier tradition. I think that is something which probably needs to be noted. And in the end, what you have pointed is very correct, that I have nobody to say it is correct, but I appreciate it, that there is no one-to-one relationship between religion and modern commodity production. One cannot be reduced to the other. But at the same time, the material conditions for abolition of a lot of nonsense has to be around, without which only brilliant and very popular exposition at the level which Santas did, or Sufis did in the rest of the world, in India, has its own limitations. Thank you.
Thank you, Anant. I agree with what you have said, and I will not make any detailed comment except to just, I will say that I think I made clear in what I was saying that I am also appreciative of the Bhakti movement and Sant Parampara. I am not throwing it out. I am not saying that it did not play a great social role, in India, and that it did not intervene in the caste system and so on, and that it did not open door for those for whom all doors were closed, in the classical, Hinduism and so on.
True enough. You said that, absolutely, yeah. All that I'm saying, that material conditions were not right. That's all. That's the only point.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. I agree. I am looking at, despite all the positive things supported by the material conditions that one could decipher in the Bhakti movement, despite that, the level at which I am looking at 1,000-year-long history, that, all little good things can add up to maybe not so good thing, in the end. The sum total of all little good things may turn out to be bad at times, and that is what seems to have happened with the Bhakti movement.
We have with us Professor Akhilesh Laktakia. I will request him to unmute himself and please.
Thank you,
Akhilesh.
Subhash. Thank you. But thank you very much for synoptic view, and much appreciated. And I also agree with Parvez. Holy books have gaping large holes. They should be kept aside. I think a lot of these issues, I mean, somebody mentioned that there is too much analysis being done on the left or the secular side, and I do agree with that. But then I'm sure the same thing is said from the right side, that too much analysis is being done on the right. Okay. I think the problem here is that we have a huge elephant in the room, and that we are, each one of us is touching its trunk or tail or a ear or something like that, and say, hey, this is the whole elephant, and therefore we have this solution to this problem. But the fact of the matter is, the elephant is that we are deeply emotional creatures, and we have one prime directive: to survive. And therefore, most of us will do anything to survive. And accordingly, therefore, capitalism can corrupt many of us. Democracy can be corrupted and all that. And despite that, some of these nice things can arise. Capitalism is not all bad and communism is not all good. Okay. Good things happen here and there. So that also answers this issue about why there was Hitler, despite the fact that Europe was was aiming towards a scientific society. And same thing happens in this current climate emergency. The temperature keeps on increasing, and yet there are serious cold episodes. Okay, as I found out 2 weeks ago in California, where it should have been sunny, but it was really cold. Okay, so these are aberrations that do take place. Are we as intellectuals thinking too much about these, the elephant's fan or the elephant's ear or the elephant's limbs, etc., and not thinking about the elephant itself, which really is very simple? We have, according to the latest IPCC report, just about 5 years to take drastic steps to combat climate emergency, to combat greenhouse gas emission. And yet I find intellectuals all over the world, myself not excluded, spending time on not combating climate emergency. All our discussions may be useless in another 15 years. This might be simply a Greek tragedy, hurtling towards the conclusion. Why don't we think about that? I've said my piece.
I agree with you, Akhilesh. We have to think about that too. But then we have to think about what is happening, what happened yesterday. Somebody was expelled from parliament for saying something. People are jailed, without any crime, and have been rotting in jail for years and haven't been even tried. There are people who are, who have committed much more heinous crimes, and they sit in very high chairs. Nothing happens to them. And there are people who are being penalized for, digging up fabricated things. So this is also part of life. While we worry about the tragedy that is going to strike us 50 years or 100 years down the line, in the meantime, we have to live every day too. And we have to worry about these things too.
It's not 100 years down the line, unfortunately. It is now more or less 5 years down the line. That's the problem. The immediacy is so high that in a synoptic view, again, just as you took a synoptic view, I think the disenfranchisement of Rahul Gandhi can be overlooked. That I'm not justifying it. In fact, it was wrong to do that, okay? But then there are a lot of wrongs taking place all the time anyway. And if we spend our collective abilities fighting these, let me call them micro wrongs, you may disagree with them on that, okay? We have this whole macro wrong about to happen, and that is this climate emergency. It's right there. It is there, it's imminent. It's not 50 years down the road. And its effects are seen here today. Its effects are seen in the United States, where the Indian nations, sovereign Indian nations, have been deprived of water. Okay. Its effects are seen in Pakistan, where 1/3 of the country approximately was underwater for a long period of time. Its effects are seen in Turkey, okay, where there have been massive problems after earthquakes. You know, the more fracking that is done to take out fossil fuels of various kinds, right? The more unstable the Earth's crust is becoming there in those areas. Okay, and this is not something that will happen 100 years down the road. That is happening now.
Okay,
That's
and
my problem.
okay, it is my ignorance, I mean, not 50 years, let us say 5 years, but even for that, Akhilesh, we will have to mobilize politically. That has to become that
Yes.
burning political question, so that I agree, and there can be many burning political questions, and we can kind of take maybe all of them, some of them, or maybe at times one of them, that is a political decision to take. Today we were worrying about something else, about this whole as you say, synoptic view of the entire civilization and the role of science in it, and I think what you are saying is equally important, and that should be discussed too, about what the world can do about it.
Yeah. We have a question by Naveen Chandra. I will read it slowly. It's little long. Why did we miss the train of enlightenment and modernity, or rather what happened, if I could add to the horizon of possibilities that were open perhaps at some point of history in this subcontinent, and what blocked them? I'm sure no one has easy convincing answer to this or that. There may be, I'm sure no one has any convincing answer to this or that. I am not really aware of this. You have some clues already that you offered for Europe. That is, at the subcontinent level, the absence or late arrival of science and limited edition of Indian modernity. By the time we had any serious encounter with it, in our collective consciousness, we were already into a mess of history. Our battles became more political, I assume, and as when required, we processed whatever was available here and elsewhere too. My queries would be to know more and think about the social processes that opened the ideological intervention into the direction of newer articulation of religion and thought rather than denouncing it. My hunch is that these social processes that could have led these mystic devotional forms of resistance available to people and society then couldn't find political articulation, additional element of the kind that would create the storm in the heaven and break the matrix of reason of the time. I say this for the reason that we were not doomed to begin with. People people everywhere are the same. 1 minute. People are everywhere the same. To the extent they are different. I know you would not judge the history from the future, but locate the structures of contradictions in the history of society. Our society that had seen many spells of counter-revolution against the reason. Which societies that had the scientific revolution in time would you point that did not have some cocktail of enlightenment, science, technology, industrial capitalism, colonialism? I would be rather inclined to ask you what Bhakti offered, and if you could draw any connection in the 19th and 20th century, where you would find many radical versions of social thought rooted in hybrid tradition, where Bhakti would perhaps be not seen in such a roadblocker to the advances that could not be made. Was Bhakti a counter-revolution in its own right, in its own time? If it was Bhakti that has to be given blame for all that did not happen, then how do you explain emergence of Bhakti itself against the other currents before the 7th century or so?
I can only say about, I mean, it's a very long and deep question and requires a lot of discussion. I can only say about what I think and what I do not think, or what I said and what I did not say. I know it is a difficult point to make. I am not denouncing bhakti, as I said, and I'm not throwing it out. And I keep pointing out that something like bhakti and something like a large chunk of millennial history from a large society, cannot be thrown out, cannot be denounced. You can't have it something else. That is what happened. And it was very large. What we are doing is, that's the phrase I use, that, I mean, what is the point of farmer cursing the soil? Soil is given. And we are trying to understand that soil that is given, and that soil got deposited over thousands of years. And then it is not I who am saying that do this to bhakti or do that to bhakti. It is others who have said, which we are contending, that the simplistic explanations about what bhakti was and what it was not, there is enormous, I mean, I just found out in the course of cursorily glancing through the literature, there is enormous literature and debate about the nature of bhakti movement. Hindi has only a tip of the iceberg, people like Hajari Prasad Dwivedi and so on. There is enormous literature where, scholars have gone into the texts, of various languages, including Sanskrit, and tried to unearth, what happened and when it happened. I am not staying at that level. That whether, people have made the point that why do you take why have people, some scholars have taken bhakti movement as a whole progressive, doing good things or going to the people and giving solace to people or fighting against the caste system and so on. Don't you see that the Saguna part of bhakti movement, and especially people like Tulsidas, could be seen more as, people who entrenched the classical Hinduist view largely, even though they were Bhakt poets and they were part of the bhakti movement, but the value system that Tulsidas represented has nothing in common with the value system that Kabir or Nanak or Raidas represented. So people have gone into those kind of scholarly details, and I am not claiming to present yet another, analysis of bhakti movement. That is why I started with a very broad question of science. What is science and what is modern science? And I am not even asking the question that why can't India understand the simple things that science is good for it or rationality is good for it? I am not that, asking that simple or foolish a question. Societies don't get analyzed by that. Societies are not one person that you can make that person sit and drill some reason into his head. Societies are large, very complex, go through various movements, long movements and many complex struggles, and something emerges out of that very complex whole. Then you can analyze it at different levels. You can analyze it what bhakti did to Dalits or to women or to this or that problem. That is one layer. And I learned from scholars of bhakti movement on that, and I'm not disputing them. Without disputing them, I am raising another question, which is a conceptual question, which is an abstract question, which what the historians will say the long wave history questions, which is the questions like French analyse school asked, I don't remember the famous historian's name, who came with that kind of approach to history, the 1,000-year millennial view on history. So without being historian and without being that, I am learning that, okay, we are large enough civilization. We have existed for 5,000-6,000 years, as Nehru says, So what are the large waves from very far away, in the intellectual space we can see? And that is where bhakti, for me, despite its internal plus points, and many twists and turns, and many sects, Nirguna, Saguna, and everything else, Vaishnava and Shakt and everything else, Shaiva, everything else, and Sufis, and even Christian bhakts, in India, that is also, can be deciphered. There is one could go into those details, and yet that does not stop one to look at bhakti, because it is large enough. It is existed long enough, and it has more than any other large phenomenon. That is what has made the Indian cultural mind. Indian culture owes more to bhakti movement than to anything, not to Vedas, not to Buddha, not to Jains, not to Upanishads, not to the classical age of Aryabhatta and Kalidas. India, the way it exists in the cultural sphere, owes most to what happened during the 1000 years of bhakti movement. And in saying that, I'm not ruling out politics. I'm not ruling out class struggles. I'm not ruling out, what was the earlier, before Muslims, who were the rulers, Muslim rulers, Sultanate. I'm not ruling out the Sultanate. I'm not ruling out the Mughals. I'm not ruling out the decay of Mughals. What happened? All that happened. All politics was happening. All economics was happening. And at the same time, bhakti movement was happening too. And it is a legitimate theoretical, political exercise to understand what was this that was happening while all the other things were happening too. And what has it done to the Indian cultural, social mind and superstructure that exists in the mind. I will say infrastructure, cultural infrastructure. So that is the level at which we are talking. And I will have to read the question again, because I hopefully the chat box will be made available to me. So then we can maybe exchange our views, after this evening also, talk about, things after this evening also.
Kisler, please unmute yourself. Kisler raised his hand. Yeah, Kisler, please.
Am I audible? Thanks a lot for the lecture. I mean, it was, in the sense, looking at the long trends, and one is not used to politically looking at long trends and try to see where we are and how we are. And to an extent, my question perhaps looks at things too micro. So I apologize beforehand for that. But I was curious to understand, the contradiction you pointed out twice. When you quoted that at 30,000 feet, show me a cultural relativist. Somebody said so, and in a different context, you also said about the contradiction of the smartphone and the anti-scientific attitude existing together. So politically speaking, that was my thing, that how science almost became in Indian masses a certain kind of instrument, where you look at certain fields scientifically, or you follow it. Even if you don't look at it, you enjoy its fruits. Say, for example, in COVID, broadly in India, people took vaccine. Even those who were banging thalis, even they took vaccine, and science led the way in creating those. So, in a sense, the certain areas of life gets claimed by science, and people are able to give it priority in those areas, as an instrument whose fruits can be enjoyed, but it's not able to claim spaces, certain other spaces, where one hoped that it will be able to claim, to go forward. And in that sense, science becomes only an instrument, while the anti-scientific attitudes and cultural things exist side by side. I'm not sure whether it applies to other civilizations as well or not, but in India, you definitely see this contradiction even among the elites. Say Ramanujan would be one example, to quote a figure. So then, and with the modern democracy and its constant urge to create a majority, everything comes into a political being, you know, like every question which one hoped will be a marginal question starts operating in a big level field, because if it can be utilized in a certain sense. So then how do you see it playing out? Because then what you answered about why those movements, say, you know, the scientific movements failed, was they were able to show certain things and people accepted it at a level of science, but there are other areas of life where, you know, they were not able to go into it. Thank you.
Yes, Kisle, good question. But you see, again, I will say the following. Just for keeping it simple, maybe I will overstate some of the positions. The way I am visualizing science or addressing the science and civilization question, what does science do to a civilization? In that, I do not put this responsibility on science to make every individual rational. That may sound very counterintuitive or shocking. It is not the job of science to make every individual rational. You know, the way individuals are made rational, or the way groups, collectives, or societies are made rational, there are many things involved in that. Science can never be the sum total of our mindscape. It cannot occupy all of our mindscape. Humans are the only elements who can be irrational. And if we have that potential to be irrational, why should we lose that potential? Okay. So let us be irrational. You know, there is no harm in being irrational, because nobody can claim that no irrational thought comes to his mind or her mind, you know. So, and Newton was irrational. I'm not defending his irrationality. I think he could have done more wonders, you know, if he did not spend half his life in interpreting the Bible and doing some foolish alchemical experiments. So, you know, I think the question that whether individuals, to what extent they become rational or not rational, that is not the responsibility of science, period. It is not the responsibility of science. Science is created by the process that I described. Science is the external gauge of humanity at the universe. From that, humanity learns something and calls it science. And then it also lives in a society and deals with each other. When it deals with each other, the social dimension comes into picture, and it cannot import its knowledge of the universe into the horizontal gauge, into the social domain. Because social domain is made by collection of all those individuals who are rational and irrational at the same time. So that is why that whatever those economists are who claim that, who starts their micro foundation of economics on the rational individual that Amartya Sen criticizes, you know, I mean, that is pure nonsense. There are no rational individuals, and Amartya Sen has proved a theorem probably of altruism. You know, altruism also exists. Altruism is very irrational, you know, and altruism is a quality of individuals. So the way the question that I am dealing with today is the question that overall, as this large body of knowledge that humanity gains as science from its external gauge at the universe, you know, what portion of that can percolate into its cultural mind? That's the question I'm asking. And at the outset itself, I am clarifying that not all of it needs to percolate into the cultural mind, you know. But then there are, as you are yourself giving examples, and there are examples galore where this conflict arises. You know, I have known people that they go to the allopathic doctor and at the same time keep on taking their homeopathic medicine too. Who knows, it works, you know. It's just like, you know, somebody in my extended family says that, okay, I don't believe in God, but still I pray, because what happens if he appears to be true? What happens if he's there, you know? So I'm just, you know, taking the insurance, you know, that if he's there, then, you know. So I mean, all those things humans do. Humans are these complicated creatures, you know, but yet you can differentiate one society from another. you can put a thermometer in a society's mind, or body, and say that this one, as a society, not as collection of individuals, as a society, is more rational and more scientific. Somehow, some way that we don't know, has imbibed the lessons of science better than some other society. And that is a valid question to ask. And that's the question I'm asking. And that's where I am raising these questions, that how do society goes through these large transitions? I am a believer, despite all the controversy. I am a believer. It is not believer. A believer is the wrong word. It appears plausible to me that something remarkable happened, in the first millennium BC, when all these grand religions came about, disconnected from each other, our Vedas and Upanishads and Buddhists and their, Jewish, Old Testament and whatnot, all those things, I think it's a legitimate question to ask that, what was the reason? Why did suddenly in 500 years, in societies that were completely disconnected with each other, something happened about which we can decipher some commonality? Those commonality can be disputed, and yet those commonalities were there. This abstract religions came about. The transcendental realm was conceived, and so on. Same way, we are seeing that all cultures are different. All societies will have their own social horizontal gauge and problems, and yet something else has arisen in the middle centuries of last millennium, 15 to 1700 in Europe, which nobody can escape. Modern science, no one can escape. No one can. So I do not see it as that, science just aggrandizes areas of life forcibly because it is hegemonic. Science is not a person who fights for power and who hegemonizes areas of life and areas of culture. Those are our words and those are our explanations. What we have to see is that what happens in the long run in those societies where science has percolated more than in some other societies. And suddenly when we jump to the think that, okay, science is forcibly uprooting traditional knowledges, science is being used by colonial masters to subjugate other countries, telling them that they are barbarians, they don't know because they don't have science. All that we should learn to not throw the baby with the bathwater. We should not put that at the door of science. So that is the argument we are making, and we are also trying to understand that how society, then given that we had this problem, that we did not make scientific revolution, it is easier for somebody who makes scientific revolution to also make it percolate into the society. It's a more organic kind of process. But if you import something from outside to make it percolate in the cultural soil, that is much more difficult, and we are faced with that difficulties. We cannot invent our own science. We have to go with the global science, whatever science exists. And that science is not our cultural creation. That has to be planted in our culture. So that is going to create problems. And that determines that what kind of politics in the long run we should do. Because only politically you can plant science into the society. You cannot plant it, by preaching, by educations, only by universities. Only politically you can plant science in a culture. And then the political forces which will not recognize this importance of science, this universality of science, what science has brought to humanity, if they don't recognize that, if they have a shorter goal of narrow nationalism to win elections, and for that they will point that what science, we had all of it in the Vedas, then that those are not the people. They can bring a smartphones, but they cannot bring science. A smartphone is not science. Technology is not science. I am not taking that definition. Science produces many things. Technology is one of that. People blame science for world wars and nuclear bombs. I don't. Science comes out of natural laws. And if somebody discovers a natural law which can be used to make a nuclear bomb, what can science do? And what can nature do? So there has been surprisingly all across the academia in very learned circles, this kind of very foolish understanding about, what science is and what modernity is and what kind of havoc it has played with humanity, which is the overall general case is the reverse.
Bhargav, please.
There is a question by Vivanamurthy. He is wondering how can we explain that the scientific revolution occurred in West, where a very entrenched organization called Church is there against scientific temperament and rationality, and did not occur in East, where such organized resistance is relatively less.
Well, again, you see, I am not expecting science to uproot church. I am not expecting science to uproot religion. That is not the criteria by which I am going to judge the success or failure of science. Because as I said, human beings are the way they are, probably they will always have religion. I don't have religion, but I have imaginations. I imagine things for future, which I know will not happen. I have dreams which will never be realized. So if church is there, like many other different kinds of associations are there, many mutts and sects are there, and given everything, the world is not going to be reshaped by my lecture. So if the given world is there and people have to find solace in that world, and many of them go to church or some mutt or some sect, and they find solace there, I am not going to challenge them with my arsenal of science. I am not going to deploy science to deprive them of whatever solace they find wherever. I have problem only when that weakness of humanity is used by certain political forces to get something out of religion that should not be gotten out of religion. So I have problem with that. If that is being used to fool people, if that is being used to contaminate politics with sectarianism or wrong ideologies, or take the country to a precipice just because some people want to be in power forever, then I have a problem with that usage of religion. So when I am talking about the success of science, relative success of science in Europe, I am not saying that to what extent church has been uprooted or faith has been uprooted. That is not the criteria, even though it may be a data that there is a larger percentage of Europeans who are atheists or agnostics, than Indians. So that's a fact of data, and one can analyze that why Europeans have a larger percentage which are agnostics or atheists than Indians. But that is for the sociologist and historian to figure out and then draw some lessons about how did that happen. I am not going to that level in my analysis. So I will plainly answer that existence of church does not prove that Western Europe is exactly in the same soup as we are. Just because church exists there, the Western society is as bad as Indian society. I am not willing to accept that.
Jafar has raised his hand. Jafar, unmute yourself and please unmute yourself.
Hi, Ravi bhai. It was a brilliant, presentation, and you built the argument extremely well. And I had earlier read your write-up also, which you had delivered elsewhere. And of course, the contentious issue here is you raising an issue about the Bhakti and the Sufi movement and how it has evolved as an anti-rationality force eventually and killed scientific temper. So that is the point at which a lot of people will throw their hands in the air and say, where is this coming from? Because all this while we have perceived these two movements as the humanizing force. I mean, if we look at religion, we look at religion from 2 points of view. One is the God that you fear, which brings in regimentation and the authority of a monarch or a supreme leader at the head, and everyone is supposed to fear that force and follow his dictates. And the other is a God that you love and that you can even flirt with or fight with or treat as an equal. And therefore, all his creation, the entire universe with all its animals and human beings and nature and environment, become a part of that existence with which you connect with as a friend, as a lover. And hence, at the center of modernity, we see eventually the creation of a naked individual who's a bearer of rights. I mean, the respect for rights and humanism is, I would say, at the center of any modern idea. And if we see Bhakti and Sufi movements, they have even, if you see Tulsidas ke Ram ji jo hai, he's a Ram that people love, and he loves them back. He's not the bow and arrow wielding Ram. He's the Stran Ram, which जैसे गांधी जी के बारे में इंसिडेंट है कि वो आरएसएस के ऑफिस में गए, वहां पे रामचंद्र जी की कोई पिक्चर नहीं लगाई गई थी, तो उन्होंने पूछा कि आपने नहीं लगाई है, तो उन्होंने कहा कि वो बहुत स्त्रैण है इसलिए नहीं लगाई है. तो वो जो उन्होंने एक, ठीक है, वो एक उन्होंने फैमिली का सिस्टम रेनफोर्स किया, एक पेट्रियार्कल वैल्यूज को रेनफोर्स किया, बट फिर भी वो भगवान ऐसा था जिससे आप बात कर सकते हैं, झगड़ सकते हैं, एक डायलॉग जारी था वहां पे भी. तो और खैर ऑफ कोर्स अगर कबीर और अन्य लोगों को ले तो एक अलग स्पेक्ट्रम पे चला जाता है. तो मुझे जब जो अभी तक इम्प्रेशन है, और अभी इस पे हम लोग और बातचीत भी कर सकते हैं कभी अलग से बैठ के भी, कि ये जो डेवलपमेंट है, एक हम फॉर्मली बिलीव करते हैं कि एक बहुत ज्यादा high quality of culture had evolved towards the 1700s, and ये जो प्लासी के अंदर डिफीट हुई है और इंपीरियलिज्म का एक फुल फोर्स यहाँ पर आया है, उसके बाद फंडामेंटलिस्ट फोर्सेस को, डिवाइसिव फोर्सेस को, फोर्सेस ऑफ हेट्रेड को पूरी तरीके से फीड किया गया है. Immense amount of capital, the whole power structure was designed in a way to, जो पूरी फंडामेंटलिस्ट आइडियोलॉजी है, और इवन जो भक्ति कल्ट्स रहे होंगे, जो के वॉइस ऑफ डिसेंट थे अगेंस्ट एनी काइंड ऑफ रेजिमेंटेशन, उनको भी उनके अंदर भी रेजिमेंटेशन लाया. तो मतलब जिसके लिए अकबर इलाहाबादी ने वो फेमस शेर कहा है कि नई तहजीब में दिक्कत ज्यादा तो नहीं होती, मजाहिब रहते हैं कायम, फकत ईमान चला जाता है. तो वो जो उसका ह्यूमन पार्ट था, या जो उसका सवाल पूछने वाला पार्ट था, जो कि इवेंचुअली एक साइंटिफिक, इंडिजिनस साइंटिफिक ब्रेक थ्रू की तरफ हमें लीड करता है. इफ वी कंपेयर, a similar example is in Japan, where they had a indigenous revolution. तो हमारे, we were perhaps sitting on the verge of a indigenous scientific revolution, which was completely hampered by the coming in of the imperialist forces. और वो subsequently जो भी events हुए, वो उसके अंदर वो forces को बढ़ाते चले गए. और इनफैक्ट आज की तारीख में जो contestation है, जो उन forces को contest कर रही है ताकत politically, वो वही लोग हैं जो उस tradition से आते हैं, जो कि सवाल पूछने वाला tradition है. This is all that I wanted to say. Thank you.
Again, it's going to be a long discussion, but let me say the following. One is that I will repeat, I am not denouncing Bhakti movement or Sufi movement or whatever. Although I do not agree with all the attributes that you are giving of modernity to that movement, that it brings down God as an equal, so it is more democratic. and it enjoys and sings and so on, and it is not an oppressive structure, that is debatable. We can see that, I mean, that Sufi movement and the Mazars and Pirs, those are typical, that is my argument, those are typical South Asian phenomena, and they have generated the same kind of surrender, even though with love, so who can question love? If somebody loves, a peer, or if somebody loves some form of God, who am I to deprive that person of that, noble, very beautiful feeling? So have that feeling with love. But then if you create a culture in which this love for whatever you have chosen as your object of love, spreads like, certain institution, certain rituals of surrender, certain ways of singing, and those who will not do that will not be accepted there, all those things we could discuss and debate. My main point is something else, and that is why I am not taking on the details of your argument. I am just repeating 2-3 main points. One is that I am saying something, forgive me if I sound arrogant, but I am saying something more subtle. I am saying I'm not going into the detailed workings of these bhakti sects or religions, including Sufis. And I'm not evaluating all their practices and behaviors as good or bad. I am not making a table that this was good and that was bad. I am looking at a large scale phenomenon of bhakti movement where I see that the out of which, philosophical discourse does not make a progress. Philosophical discourse gets stopped when bhakti comes to reign, the Indian civilization. It does continue, in select examples, including Adi Shankar was late in 9th century. Some of the other saints were late in the first half of second millennium. But more or less that tradition, philosophical tradition, dies down. The simple model I am proceeding from that everybody has religion and everybody will be religious. But out of religious discourses, some secular discourses should also emerge. Secular philosophy should also emerge. Same way, everybody has practice, everybody has science, everybody knows how to grow food and cook food and build a house. But out of all those, traditional knowledge, something like science should emerge. Some more systematic knowledge should emerge. That is what I am expecting. And if it happens in some large civilizations, and if that does not happen in some other large civilizations, that is why Needham asked his questions. And I think that it's a very valid question. And the answer for that kind of large question, that why did some large civilizations proceeded this way and some other large civilization proceeded that way, cannot be answered by going into the details of what positive points a Sufi had or a Bhakt poet had, or I do not know the analog of the Chinese case, So we are talking at that level. You brought an indigenous scientific revolution. That is where I will have questions. Forget about indigenous scientific revolution. There is not going to be any indigenous scientific revolution. And Japan example that you gave is exactly wrong. There was no indigenous scientific revolution in Japan. Tokugawa Japan in late 19th century, that is when that development started, when the power of samurai, the feudal power was broken, and a modernist emperor came into existence and imbibed, imported science, lock, stock, and barrel, imported science from abroad. And that is, Japan is, you are right in pointing out, Japan we should study. Japan is one example out of West, non-West, which has become equal to them. And Japan is a good example where you see that the science is same, but culture is very different. Japanese are very different from Americans or from Europeans, and they do the same science. That is the point I am making, that everybody will have to take the same science, but I am not expecting everybody to become Europeans or Americans who had, who may have made the initial breakthrough. And Japanese are a good example. They took science from there, and then they started adding to that science. Phenomenal growth of science happened in Japan, which was very, in many ways, very traditional and very different from Europe, And the same thing China is doing. In China, that is happening right now. China's science is being implanted in a systematic way in the Chinese culture. No matter what disagreement you have with the Chinese political system and Chinese economic system, no one can deny the miracle that is happening in China. And that miracle is not just, becoming the workshop of the world and producing for everybody. China is going through more thoroughgoing changes. It is modernizing. China, my understanding, if China was the topic of the day to discuss, I will say that the way Europe spread out modernity, scattered modernity all over the world, the Chinese modernity, which is a combination of in universal science and Chinese culture, Chinese modernity, I don't see a possibility of that being scattered all over the world. Chinese modernity will still be insular. Chinese modernity, even if China becomes the greatest power and it produces the best science, still China will not become the exporter of modernity as Europe became exporter of modernity. So those differences are there. People are very different. Civilizations are very different. Japanese have made the example that, okay, a non-West can become equal to them. And Chinese are now presenting that example that a non-West can become equal to them, And when they become equal to them, will their modernity become as they are exporter of manufactured goods, will they become exporter of values too, cultural values too? I doubt. And that is a deep question. I don't know how Europeans became exporters of modern values too, along with modern goods. And Chinese will be, in my reading, I could be wrong, that in Chinese will be exporter of goods and exporters of knowledge, but they will not be exporters of values. That is how different civilizations and societies are. And those are very difficult questions, much beyond our capacity. So let us leave it at that.
We are with us Professor Shekhar Ramakrishnan. I will request him to share his views. Shekhar, please.
This whole business with professor is very embarrassing.
You are.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to. No, I was clearing my throat. I didn't want to regale you all with how well I can clear my throat. Okay, very broadly, I do disagree with Ravi. But before I get to that, let me say two things about Indian science that I have found most fascinating, which Ravi has heard and maybe other people haven't heard. And one, this is what I learned from talking to various historians of science here in the US. One is the disinterest in mathematical proofs. And so Ravi mentioned Pythagoras' theorem being known in India, but apparently there was no attempt to prove. And so there has been this long tradition in Indian science of not being on some sense much more empirically based rather than a focus on proving, which is something that the Greeks were very interested in. And so, I think that Ravi may want to think about what role some of that may have played in scientific development or lack of development in China, in India. Apparently, the Chinese had a proof for Pythagoras' theorem, and some other cultures did. But in India, apparently, it was entirely empirical. You say, you try this, and it works. That was how the proofs were obtained or provided. You show by actually trying out that the theorem works. And somewhat related, I heard in a talk that during the Mughal period, when heliocentrism had come to the Mughal court, the Jaipur court was still discussing what is called the geoheliocentric view. That is, things ultimately revolve around the earth, but all the planets and so on revolve around the sun, and the sun entire thing revolves around. And fairly complicated equations were developed to solve this geoheliocentric system, which may go back to Aryabhatta. I'm not sure. But it seems that it was very important in the Jaipur court to be consistent with certain aspects of Hindu belief and fit the science within that. Because otherwise it seemed that heliocentrism would have come, to Indian science much earlier. So in some way, maybe maybe some of this supports Ravi's view, and maybe some of it doesn't, because I do think some of these things predate the Bhakti movement and so on. So that said, I just want to, in a way, I don't have some definite thing to say, how Ravi is wrong or anything. So again, speaking from personal experience, I have a number of colleagues that I work closely with who are very, very good scientists, and they're very rational and so on, but they're also religious. I'm always been puzzled. How do you reconcile a scientific view with being religious? And it seems that many of them have sort of a personal attitude to God, not in a dogmatic way, not following some organized, even though they may go to church or synagogue, they don't follow the doctrine, the doctrinal form of the religion. They have a personal relationship with the deity. And I think that to me, bhakti is sort of like that it stresses the personal relationship of the person with God. I'm not a fan of bhakti or anything. So in that sense, on a theoretical level, just looking at my colleagues, I'm not able to see a conflict with between a bhakti type attitude and scientific development. I feel that that's where I have a problem with what Ravi is saying. And finally, the point that Ravi made in passing, which he said he did not want to deal with here, about how compared to Nehruvian times, we have more development, better off country, and we have a movement that is taking us back to Stone Age, a Hindu Stone Age. And I think that is, for me, that's the most upsetting part about thinking about India at the moment. I'll shut up now.
Well, I agree, even though Shekhar disagrees with me, but I agree with him, because that fits into what I am saying. I have no problem with scientists being religious, including Newton, So that to me, because I always, conceptualize human beings which have these sides, where they can be perfectly rational and scientific in one domain, and yet they may have their beliefs which may not be, which may be unprovable by those by the methods they use in their work, in the other part of their brain. So I don't see that as supporting or refuting the role that millennial bhakti movement as a whole done to our society. These examples, I agree with Shekhar, and those examples are known to all of us because they are all around us. We have, most people who are our scientist friend are also believers. A lot of them are believers, and their belief is more sophisticated. Then they can argue about it, and they can draw a line that, okay, this is something that is my personal, that is my personal relationship with the deity or God or with some idea, and that is not subject to argument. They can say that, and the modern viewpoint is that we respect that, and despite that, the problem I have, if I can add to, Shekhar did not say that, but what I can add to that is that when this kind of the kind of room you give, and that should be given to humans to have their beliefs while being rational, the reverse should not be used. The problem I have is that when scientific people have beliefs that cannot be tested on the same criteria, and those are used by others to say that, oh, who are you to talk about rationality and science and some scientific values seeping into culture. Newton himself did not believe in that. Are you greater than Newton? Then that is where we have a problem. So we give room to whatever you want to believe, whatever you want to worship, and so on. Be religious, I have no problem with that. The problem is the reverse, that the domain that is the domain of belief unnecessarily comes into the arena to fight science. That is where I have a problem. And that is what the right wing is utilizing, that it can gather people, gather large masses, large number of people to challenge the scientific culture by saying that, look, scientific culture is invading the realm of faith and belief, or religious realm, or sacred domain. Whereas the actually what is happening is the reverse. The sacred domain is illegitimately roped into attacking the scientific culture. So that is the struggle, and I think it has to be visualized like that.
We are taking the last question. Rajkumar Singh has raised his hand, and I will request him to unmute himself and share his question. Rajkumar Singh.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Please.
Thank you, Subhashji.
Huh.
Thank you, Raviji, for giving such a wonderful lecture. I am of the opinion that science and non-science exist simultaneously. And even scientist or non-scientist, they should think from this perspective that in society we have two types of peoples. One who eats without efforts and one who put efforts. Now technology makes things more complicated. Because of technology, we can produce more goods. So large number of people in modern civilization are getting unemployed. This is one of the biggest problem mankind is facing in modern technological era. I am of the opinion that most of the scientists doesn't mean that only physics, chemistry, math. It's in all sphere of the field, political science, economic science, social science. And I think 99.99% of these scientists don't understand the relationship between state, money, economy, and nation building. That's why all type of people are talking different things which are not directly connected in these four factors, which are predominant in my opinion. So I am of the view that those who are intellectually enlightened should think the relationship between the state, money, economy, and nation building. After that, I think we can find the better solution and we can have a society where people are employed. If they are employed, their life is good. If life is good, then they will have more scientific way of doing things and living things, in my opinion. Thank you, sir.
Subhash, before we conclude, I forgot to say one thing in response both to Zafar and Shekhar. One of the things that I would like to remind is that the problem I started with is that I have no problem if a civilization finds its own way of life with its own mix or combination of the rational and the irrational. I am not quarreling with that. I am willing to give the right to every civilization to develop whichever way they want to. But the problem I raised at the beginning itself that the world is such that no civilization is left alone. And when civilizations interact, and I will say interact is a milder word, when they fight, when they go to war, when they colonize each other, when they brutalize each other, somebody wins, somebody is defeated. I'm not even saying that those who are more scientific or who are more cultured, they always win. And those who are, quote unquote, whatever be the definition, less cultured, always lose. But it happens, and every civilization then is forced to think that, okay, these are my values, these are our values. We have lived with these values for thousands of years. And yet they came in the way of our interaction with some other civilization. We got defeated and we got overruled. And then there are many examples. Zafar was giving that example too, that then we blame that civilization that, oh, British came and divided us, or otherwise communalism was not there. British came and they intensified the caste system. Otherwise, caste system was, nice, cozy, mutually respecting caste system. That is, that is not, acceptable to me. First of all, it was not like that. And just because you have to fight the British, don't romanticize the pre-British. I can understand the nationalist movement that it needed to fight the British and created a sense of nationalism. But now we are past that. Now we are sitting today. Now we have to decide what kind of society we want to build and what role science will play in that. And then we keep on raking this thing that post-colonial theorist I mentioned, raking up that, oh, this thing in India needs to be decolonized and that thing in India needs to be decolonized. So all these grand theorists, sitting in high chairs in Western academia, they want to decolonize this and decolonize that. Is that our problem? Are we in this state because some mischief that the Britishers did, that is why, we were defeated forever? Now, this kind of thing, I don't blame even our tormentors, our rulers, our exploiters, our oppressors forever. I have to think that why did we get defeated? And that is why I gave that parable of Archimedes. That how can we say that our civilization was great and we keep on getting defeated for one reason or the other, and then we keep on blaming the victors, the people who may have been brutal, they may have been unjust, they may have been looters and plunderers, and yet we could not defend ourselves. So this one has to understand all of that. There is no point in singing praises for our bhakti, our Sufis, our dargahs, or whatever, when we keep on getting defeated. And we are getting defeated even today. Nobody is invading us, and yet we are getting defeated even today. So that point, that is the worry I have. I'm not comparing bhakti with something else, or within bhakti sagun with nirgun, or Sufis with some other sects. After all, we have a society which has the largest density not only of temples and mosques, we have largest density of sects and mutts that have direct intervention in social life. Political mobilization takes through them. Kumbh Mela and Kanwariyas walking over the roads gets mobilized through them. All the city rises in which we live, what they call resident welfare associations, are infiltrated and run by them. So when all this happens, then how can we say that we can nothing happened when bhakti was there and nice song and dance? They created the sects which somehow landed up in those sects where Asaram is jailed for rape, and yet there is no visible reduction in the number of his disciples. And who created this society in which rapists can be jailed and yet their bhaktas can be there? And there are many examples. I am taking just one name because he is jailed for that. I cannot be brought to court for saying that. So all that, why have this rosy picture? Somehow we landed in this society. somehow religion has, I have a problem with religion playing a role in politics, but it is not only that. Religion is dictating, not religion, I wouldn't even say it religions. These sects and mathas, they are dictating the social life of a large part of our society. And at times they get politically roped in too. And these sects and have, a very large economic resources. They are richest as, than most of the corporates, put together. Religious wealth is more than that, So when we discuss, the Bhakti movement or our religious history theoretically, we have to have a very robust, pragmatic understanding of what India is. It is not something abstract philosophical principle that we are discussing. All that needs to be explained, that how come India is the land where the per capita number of sects and mutts and temples is probably the highest in the world. And that is not the only thing. Their intervention in social life and even in personal life, there are no such examples as the subcontinent. So that we are faced with all these problems, and we have to, if my answer is not right, somebody has to come up with a right answer. Problems are there.
Bhargav, please.
Probably we have all the questions in chat box are also over, and we probably have to move towards the conclusion of this session. And once again, thanks to Ravi for bringing.
Sorry, Bhargav. Sorry to interrupt. Can the chat box be made available to me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. When the recording is there, then that will be available. So thanks once again for Ravi for bringing up these important questions that are plaguing our society and trying to give a big picture how this society is like this, especially from the lens of why science could not percolate into this culture and what are the deeper problems. And of course, the undercurrent is that because culture is now so impacting politics, so all that will become political too. He also mentioned that because in modernity becoming a force in a society, how political system has a important role to play. So that will be the background. But without understanding how our society is like this, why this society is like this, and why science could not really entrench here, modernity could not entrench here, without dealing with these important questions, it will be very difficult to understand the current crisis and also to figure out ways. So once again, thank you, Ravi, for this lecture, and all. Thanks very much for all the participants who patiently stayed and for those who actively participated with various responses. Thank you very much. With this, maybe we can close the session. Thank you very much.